Upon hearing the middle-aged man's shout and seeing his warped expression, Hazel's eyes, which were filled with rage and hatred, gradually froze before melting into a confused and lost look. It wasn't only her. Mact and Rihanna, as well as Dwayne Dantes, fell silent. No one spoke for a moment. Even Fours, who had concealed herself, also lost the sense of excitement she originally had, no longer having that strong sense of justice. After more than 10 seconds, Mac stopped looking at his assailant and turned his head to say to his bodyguards, "One of you stay here. Watch the scene and the suspect. Wait for the police." Having said that, he paused and said to his valet, "Get a few reporters to cover this matter." After preliminarily dealing with the matter, this House of Commons Member of Parliament surveyed the area and discovered that several passersby were attempting to gather over to check on what was happening. He then looked at Dwayne Dantes and apologized with a smile, "My apologies for putting you in such danger. I never expected the matter to develop this way. We did consider the actual situation of similar factory owners and coal suppliers, and we had provided them some assistance and interim measures. Who knew? Coming up with a bill is something, but the actual implementation is an entirely different matter. When atmospheric pollution becomes abnormally pressing and the various parties exert immense stress, it's no surprise that a cookie-cutter solution is employed." Klein sighed and said with a self-deprecating laugh, "There's no need to keep my feelings into consideration. I've been in even more dangerous situations in the past." On the surface, it appeared as though he was referring to his encounters when doing business in the southern continent's West Balam. In fact, he had recalled Megos, who was pregnant with an evil god spawn, the terrifying meteor that had crashed down from the sky, Cynthia, who wanted to bear a child for Admiral Amirius, and the Rose School of Thought angel and numinous episcopate monster who had collapsed the mountain outside Byam. Compared to these, what had happened here was like a drizzle. He didn't even need to consider his own safety since there was Zio, Miss Magician, and Hazel. He didn't even take action besides dodging normally like any experienced adventurer would do. His focus was on whether this would result in a storm. Mac sighed and nodded. "I can tell that you're very calm. I once doubted your experiences, but now I'm convinced. All right, Dwayne. Let's return home separately. Leave the rest to the police. If there's a need to take a statement, they will do it at your residence." Klein nodded and said to Mac and family, "Be safe." Mac nodded seriously and sighed once again. Backland's social season has just begun, and this happened. Cherish the peace we have now. Backland's social season is marked by the return of the House of Lords Members of Parliament. It seems to have begun since last weekend. And this week, 2 cases have happened consecutively. The harm dealt to Baron Cindras, and the assault on Member of Parliament Mact. As he thought, Klein didn't stay put. He brought Richardson, who clearly looked a little shaken, and walked towards his carriage. When he got into it, he watched the scenery fly backward as he sighed and half closed his eyes. He was presently unable to determine if the assault hadn't involved Beyonder powers, as everything that had happened could be done by ordinary people. As for the middle-aged man, he had sufficient reason to do so. This didn't need deliberate fabricating, as Klein believed that in Backland, at present, there were more than one former factory owner or employer that had lost their livelihood because of similar developments. The only thing that felt questionable was that Mact was the target. Although the House of Commons were the supporters, advocates of the environmental measures, often making relevant speeches and are interviewed by the papers, he wasn't the most obvious target during the passing of the bill. In comparison, there was a higher chance that members of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council were picked as targets for revenge. Klein leaned on the carriage wall as he slowly opened his eyes. Seeing that it was already dark and cloudy with rain already pattering down. Once again, he realized how the maelstrom hidden beneath the seemingly calm Backland surface was intensifying. Reining in his thoughts, Klein raised his left palm and tapped his pocket. In it was what he believed to be Frank Lee's reply and some unknown mushrooms. Klein really yearned to return home to head above the grey fog and use the newly received mushrooms to communicate with Creeping Hunger, doing so to regain the use of the sealed artifact. With the storm already brewing, he believed that there was a need for him to quickly be returned back to his optimal combat strength. And in this aspect, Creeping Hunger was essential. Unfortunately, he had 2 Beyonder bodyguards following him, so it was best if he didn't head above the grey fog for the time being. "I clearly don't need any protection, but I spent a few £100 to hire 2 people to restrict my actions. How helpless I am as a tycoon." Klein finally sighed inwardly as he raised the cup of black tea that had just been prepared by Richardson. He took a sip as his facial muscles tensed up before relaxing. Klein looked down and discovered that there had been twice the number of lemon slices in his black tea than usual. He glanced at Richardson in an unnoticeable manner, and he saw that his valet was in a daze, as though he was still lost in the horror of the assault. As cowardly as usual, Klein commented inwardly as he placed the porcelain cup on the table. Late at night. 39 Bockland Street, Member of Parliament Max House. Hazel sat before her dressing table, looking at the grey rat sitting on a powder box. After a long silence, she said, "Was my father wrong? The matter he pushed for is clearly a good thing. There is nothing that is beneficial to everyone. There will always be those who benefit and those who suffer from it. At such times, a relevant bill or plan requires thought, compensation, and aid. If your father had done them, the problem isn't his. Conversely, it also means he's cold and ruthless," the rat said perfunctorily. Hazel recalled for a few seconds and relaxed her expression. "During dinner, I sensed that there was something very valuable hidden inside the cupboard in the pantry, but when I later got an opportunity to open it, there was nothing." The rat was taken aback as it said in thought, "Perhaps that was Dwayne Dantes' bodyguard. He was recently embroiled in a suicide case, and it's said that it involves Baron Cinders. Hiring a bodyguard to protect him in secret is normal. The bodyguard inside the cupboard might also possess supernatural powers, carrying mystical items with them. That's why you were able to sense it." Hazel nodded gently and accepted the explanation before subconsciously muttering to herself, "I wonder what kinds of supernatural powers those bodyguards have." After saying that, she swept the grey rat with a puzzled look. "How do you know Dwayne Dantes was embroiled in a troublesome case?" The rat squeaked. "My present state is very suitable for me to eavesdrop into the conversations of others." As it spoke, it looked in the direction of 160 Bockland Street, the glint in its eyes shimmering. Based on the sleeping rotation, Fors was asleep as she felt herself float to an ancient and majestic castle. In it were all kinds of Beyonder ingredients and mystical items. There were even 2 blurry tarot cards. However, she didn't take any of them away, as they were sealed by an invisible force field. Fors looked around in an attempt to find the means to remove the seal. Finally, she saw a complicated symbol drawn at the top of the dome. It was a symbol formed from fate and concealment. "If I find an item engraved with this symbol, I'll be able to unseal some treasure." Fors immediately came to a realization when she snapped awake. She discovered that she had curled into a ball on the carpet in the room. She had a thin silk blanket covering her. She and Zio didn't dare sleep in the reclining chair, afraid that Dwayne Dantes, who often sat in it, would notice something different. Rubbing the edges of her brows, Fors sat up and saw Zio having her back to the wall of the master bedroom. She was seriously listening for any stirrings. As Fors walked to Zio, she said with a frown, "I feel that there is some secret hidden here. I had a strange dream, dreaming of an exaggerated treasure trove and a complicated symbol." As an astrologer, she instinctively believed that there was a problem with her dream. Noticing the serious look on Fors's face, Zio suppressed her words of doubt and said after some thought, "Perhaps there really is some sort of secret. I once heard a proverb regarding the mysterious world. It goes, when a Beyonder element is discovered somewhere, there must be a second one. Ignoring the butler who we can't tell if he possesses Beyonder powers or not, that Miss Hazel is someone with a Beyonder element. Around her, or should I say, that this street, likely has a second one." Fors nodded gently before laughing. "However, it has nothing to do with us. We will receive our remuneration tomorrow evening and terminate this bodyguard mission. We will leave this place. The most pitiful of all is Dwayne Dantes. He's innocent and ordinary, but he ends up involved with troublesome matters and Beyonder elements." Having said that, Fors looked at Zio and joked, quickly wish him that the goddess would watch over him. "I'm a believer of the god of steam and machinery. I won't be able to do so." Zio seriously considered for 2 seconds before drawing a crimson moon on her chest, piously muttering, "May the goddess bless Mr. Dwayne Dantes." Fors was snapped out of her reverie as she covered her mouth and yawned. "I'll head out to patrol the building. It's your turn to sleep after another 15 minutes. All right." Zio was clearly more awake than Fors. Fors immediately headed for the door and pressed on the wall with her outstretched hand, arriving at the corridor. She was just about to walk to the staircase when she sensed that there was a slight stir coming from the room of Dwayne Dantes' valet. Fors's eyes darted slightly as she cautiously headed over. She opened a tiny door in the wall and peeked in. She then saw Richardson jumping a crazy dance that had a tinge of mystery. A spirit dance. Doesn't this valet believe in the Evernite goddess? He's secretly worshipping death. Fawes frowned as she watched Richardson finish his spirit dance, softly praying for death's protection to help him avoid all kinds of danger. After everything came to an end, Fawes tsked and shook her head. She silently said to herself, "What a pitiful man, Mr. Dantes." After returning to the room with the balcony, Fawes looked at Zio, who had her back against the wall, and whispered, "Guess what I saw? That male servant, Dantes's valet, is actually a believer of death. He was dancing a spirit dance and praying." Zio widened her eyes before relaxing her expression. "When it comes to Mr. Dantes, that's the least of his concerns. Yeah, that valet named Richardson is clearly of Southern Continent heritage. Perhaps he was born there, so it's not surprising that he worships death." Fawes replied with a smile, "I know. I just find it interesting. Aren't there a little too many people with secrets around Dwayne Dantes? I won't be surprised if I were to discover one day that all the living beings in this building except him, including the housekeeper, maids, gardeners, carriage drivers, earthworms, bugs, and rats, are related to mystery and beyonders. I would be able to easily accept that reality." Zio rolled her eyes. If that were the case, Mr. Dwayne Dantes definitely wouldn't be a simple person. Having beyonders and supernatural creatures around him means that he might be the spawn of an evil god or a grounded angel. Without waiting for Fawes to expand the scope of the conversation, Zio asked, "Didn't you say that you had a strange dream involving treasure? Why aren't you curious or considering what it symbolizes? That perhaps it might actually exist." Fawes chuckled. "Such a dream often implies trouble and danger. I'll consider it again if I have a chance of encountering that symbol." Although she said that, her true thoughts were, "There's quite a bit of a problem with that dream. Who knows if there's a ploy behind it? I'll consult Mr. Hanged Man, Ma'am Hermit, and Mr. World at the Tarot Gathering next week before deciding what to do. They are experienced and powerful beyonders. Perhaps they have had similar experiences." "You've matured." Zio nodded, and exerting strength in her back, she bounced off the wall and walked to the spot where Fawes had been sleeping before. "Mature?" Fawes scoffed and leaned in towards her friend. She straightened her back and looked down at her friend's hair. Without waiting for Zio to become enraged, she sighed. "You're the one who matured. I still remember this time last year. You did things based on instinct, arbitrating with your fist. From time to time, you would commit mistakes without realizing it and become lost. You're much better now." Zio was stunned as she lay down and covered herself with the thin silk blanket. With her back facing Fawes, she grumbled, "The main reason why I got lost was because of you being a burden by my side." Fawes chortled and nodded in thought. "That's a characteristic of an apprentice. It has nothing to do with me. Get it?" Seeing Zio on the floor, she walked to the wall adjacent to the master bedroom and seriously started being a bodyguard. As the night slowly passed, the sky gradually lit up. Klein got up to have breakfast and received visits from 2 batches of policemen and a batch of reporters. They were here for further investigations regarding Quiron's suicide case, while another was to obtain more details regarding Member of Parliament Mac's assault. With Walter's help, Dwayne Dantes met them and quickly handled the matters. In the afternoon, Mac suddenly visited and urged Klein, "Join me at the club for a game of tennis." He was a member of a few clubs, but there was only one club that overlapped with Dwayne Dantes, East Balham Military Veterans Mess. This is to confirm the arms deal. Klein managed to read between the lines and immediately got Richardson to get his coat, top hat, and cane. He rode on his carriage and headed to the sandy yellow unique building at Hillston Borough with the Member of Parliament. They entered the club and used the same room as before. Klein once again met the long-faced Army colonel from the Ministry of Defense, Calvin. After habitually exchanging pleasantries for a few minutes, Calvin finally focused on the main topic at hand. He looked at Dwayne Dantes and said with a chuckle, "I heard from Mac that you can have £20,000 available. Although it will make me tight on funds, it's true that I can," Klein replied with a smile. Calvin nodded in satisfaction and said after some pondering, "There won't be any need for £20,000 for now. The batch of firearms, explosives, and small number of cannons reserved for you is in a particular warehouse in East Balham. There's not that much, enough to equip about 3,000 to 4,000 people. Based on the price of decommissioning them, it will cost £10,000 at most. Of course, you will have to give me £15,000. He didn't mince his words in any way, as though this was common in the low-end military. "No problem," Klein said and nodded calmly. Calvin immediately chuckled. "Excellent. Mac has a keen eye for people. A person who wants to do such business absolutely mustn't be stingy. That batch of firearms is worth at least £20,000 in West Balham. If you can find a suitable buyer and fully showcase your experience in the area, it's entirely possible to sell them for £30,000 or even more. By the way, the transportation fees and escort fees will be borne by you. We will only send 2 or 3 personnel to assist you. As expected, there will be monitors. Klein listened in silence, believing that it was time that he urged Admiral of Stars and Danitz to quickly provide him with information on West Balham. He pondered for a moment and said, "Roughly when will it begin?" "That batch of firearms will take another 2 weeks before being placed in the corresponding warehouse. When it happens after that period is up to you. You don't have to pay it in full at once. You can first pay £8,000 to £10,000 and pay the rest when everything is settled." Calvin wore an expression as though things were highly negotiable. 2 weeks later. "That will be closer to the end of the month. I'll definitely have to wait until the party of the Snake of Fate's birth before leaving. I'm still waiting for his placenta blood." Klein's thoughts raced as he said, "I'll need to carry out some preparatory work. I'll probably head to the southern continent in early July." Calvin Macht exchanged looks with Macht and gently rubbed his palms. "No problem. Ellipsis." Outside the East Balham Military Veterans Mess, Zio and Fors hid themselves on the roof of a nearby building, monitoring the people that were coming and going. Zio knew that there were many Beyonders in the club, so she didn't dare get Fors to sneak her in to provide protection to Dwayne Dantes at a close distance. All they did was wait outside. Thankfully, this is Backland. Even though there's no smog this season, there will be no lack of clouds. The sun wouldn't be too strong, otherwise, my skin would definitely turn red, Fors mumbled as she hid herself in the shadows. Zio was about to say something when she saw a carriage drive into the back door of the club. It was entirely brown in color and had a trademark coat of arms. It was made of flowers and rings. Viscount Stratford's carriage. Zio silently mumbled as she hurriedly widened her eyes and focused. She then saw a familiar figure who was a stranger to her get off the carriage. Surrounded by bodyguards, the figure entered the East Balham Military Veterans Mess. "What's wrong?" Fors noticed her friend's abnormality. Zio didn't conceal the matter as she frankly said, "I saw Viscount Stratford. He also came to this club." "That captain of the Royal Guards?" Fors asked in surprise. "Yeah." Zio nodded heavily. Fors turned agape, hoping to say something, but she was at a loss as to what to say. All she could do was look around, pretending to monitor for anything that was amiss. After a while, she saw Dwayne Dantes walk out. 160 Bockland Street received another guest in the afternoon. This time, it was the largest shareholder of the coin company, Ma Mary. "I'm very sorry that my request embroiled you in such trouble. I never expected Baron Cindras to do something like that. Poor Quiron. He was planning on bringing his family to Winter County for the summer." Mary Schott apologized with hints of anger. Klein replied calmly, "I agree with your views on Quiron. He was really unfortunate. However, this matter probably wasn't done by Baron Cindras. It might be a trap that's targeting him." Mary nodded heavily. "I've heard of the theory. It's said that the police department is planning to hire a skilled forensic pathologist to dissect the corpse to search for any missing clues." Her final sentence was automatically replaced by Klein as, "The police department is planning to hire a skilled spirit medium from the Church of Evernite to examine the corpse to search for any missing clues. I wonder what will be discovered." Klein raised his right hand and tapped his chest 4 times in a clockwise fashion. "May the goddess give Quiron peace and that the true murderer behind his death will suffer punishment." Mary responded in the same way before saying, "In order to prevent you from being affected by this matter, I plan on purchasing the shares from you ahead of time. I'll add an additional £1,000 above the highest price to date. You don't have to worry about my funds. I've recently been busy borrowing money from the banks." Klein sighed and replied, "I'm very grateful for your kind intentions, but any advance transferring of the shares will need to be done with the church. I've already donated it to them. I plan on using the income I receive to establish a bursary foundation that targets the poor." This was the first time Mary was hearing of such news. She was momentarily stunned and speechless. After 10 seconds, she exhaled and said, "Your character, generosity, and wisdom truly impresses me." As she said that, she looked at Dwayne Dantes with an additional look of admiration. Klein humbly diverted the compliment to the goddess before pausing. He then asked with a stern expression, "Ma Mary, I have a question that I hope you can answer. When you decided to clash with Baron Syndras to protect your control over the coin company, was it purely by your own will, or a result of persuasion by others? Mary frowned and frankly replied, all the persuasion that was directed at me was to ask me to give up. Klein immediately fell silent as he didn't discuss the matter further. He casually mentioned Member of Parliament Max Assault before sending the lady out of 160 Bockland Street. After dinner, Walter came to the half-opened room with the balcony and said to his employer on the reclining chair, "Sir, the 2 bounty hunters have been dismissed. It cost a total of £300 for 3 days, excluding the food provided. They're finally gone." Klein immediately relaxed as he nodded, acknowledging his butler's reply. Following that, he eagerly entered the master bedroom, planning on taking out the mushrooms sent to him from Frank Lee and bringing them up above the grey fog to communicate with Creeping Hunger. When he came to the desk with the hidden mushrooms, he saw a letter held down by an ink bottle. Klein picked it up in puzzlement and tore it open. He quickly scanned it as his expression turned odd. "Dear Mr. Dantes, we are the bodyguards you hired. In the past few days, we discovered certain matters that we feel obligated to inform you. Therefore, we entered your bedroom to leave this letter while you were having dinner. Your butler might be researching black magic, your valet is secretly worshipping death, someone among your neighbors has supernatural powers. The street where you live might have certain secrets that cause people to have strange dreams. You should understand some of the terms mentioned. We won't provide a further explanation. May the goddess bless you." Quote ellipsis quote. Klein looked at the letter in his hand as he was momentarily unsure whether to laugh or cry. After a few seconds, he couldn't help but give a self-deprecating laugh. "Just from the contents of this letter, I'm really quite pitiful. And the matters described don't seem to be problematic in any way." As he shook his head with a smile, Klein held a letter in one hand and suddenly shook it to the side. Scarlet flames surged and devoured the piece of paper. "Regardless, Miss Zio and Miss Magician are rather kind people. The only problem is that what they mentioned are things I already know. In fact, I'm more aware of the reasons than they are." As Klein mumbled, he found the mushrooms he had hidden. There were a total of 4 breeds of mushrooms. One was 3 dried products that could react with water and fish. The second was a new breed with golden caps as they emitted the smell of flour. The third was white with specks of black spots, they were swollen and puffy, as though a liquid was flowing within them as they exuded the smell of milk. The fourth had strange gills running down its 2 sides, their surface was filled with dense and soft scales. Klein swept his gaze at these mushrooms and took out a gold coin. He caught it after flicking it. After confirming the results, he took off the ordinary glove he previously wore. With his bare skin, he grabbed the 3 new mushrooms to test various scenarios that Frank Lee hadn't mentioned. They felt normal to the touch, and there weren't any changes to the mushrooms. Klein heaved a sigh of relief, no longer afraid that the level of danger they possessed had exceeded his capability. He was previously afraid that these mushrooms would immediately produce roots upon contact with items of flesh and blood, devouring whatever was in its path to grow before dispersing its spores. Perhaps it's the relatively strong light from the gas wall lamps, or it might be as a result of plucking them which causes these mushrooms to lose most of their living characteristics. They will be revived only under special conditions, such as being in the stomach of a living creature. With the intention to figure out the truth, he drew all the curtains to the master bedroom and extinguished all the wall lamps. Then, he picked up the new mushrooms with his bare hand and determined that there wasn't anything abnormal about them as they hadn't fed on his body. After doing this, Klein lit the wall lamps again and set up a ritual, sacrificing the mushrooms above the grey fog. Sitting in the fool's seat, he wasn't in a rush to summon Creeping Hunger. He first summoned a metal bottle that had his blood inside to the long bronze table. Right on the heels of that, he poured a drop of blood on the table and piled the 3 new breeds of mushrooms onto it. In just a second, the mushrooms suddenly softened at the parts where they made contact with the blood. They squirmed as they enveloped the blood. Whatever they made contact with grew a dense array of needle-like hair. Quote ellipsis quote. The corners of Klein's lips twitched when he saw that. He directly adjusted some of the powers of the mysterious space above the grey fog, suppressing all the mushrooms. Then, he sent the drop of blood back into the metal bottle and closed the lid. He had roughly understood the characteristics of the mushrooms. Without wasting any time, he summoned Creeping Hunger from the junk pile. Holding the thin human-skinned glove, Klein placed it on the table and removed the seal around the mushrooms. Then, he saw the Creeping Hunger support itself with its 5 fingers before standing up with great difficulty. It began retreating rapidly like it was playing a piano. "So you do know fear?" Klein revealed a genial smile. He pressed the glove down and, gifted it with some of the powers of the mysterious space above the grey fog. Then, he grabbed a mushroom with his other hand and brought it close to Creeping Hunger. The human-skinned glove struggled with all its might but ultimately failed to escape his grasp as it clearly began trembling. Klein stopped moving the hand with the mushroom and chuckled. "Are you still going to randomly praise the true creator?" Creeping Hunger continued struggling without giving a reply. Klein thought for a moment before he compromised. "I'll allow you to praise once a day. In the day or in the evening." Creeping Hunger's struggling weakened, but it didn't stop. "TSK." Klein continued negotiating with an unperturbed expression, "thrice a day. During breakfast, lunch, and dinner time. However, you will need to warn me ahead of time." Creeping Hunger struggled twice before sprawling onto the desk, motionless. After another round of negotiations, Klein successfully reached an agreement with Creeping Hunger. However, eating daily was instinctual to the item. It was unable to be weakened much as a result of the negotiations. Therefore, he needed to wait for the sealing method provided by ASIC. At present, what Klein could do was bring Creeping Hunger around without it eating. However, he needed to come up with a meal within 24 hours. How troublesome. Thankfully, after Creeping Hunger fused with Mr. and the mushroom, its living characteristic has strengthened, otherwise, there would be no way to make any negotiations with it. Klein commented wistfully. Finally, he did a divination regarding the recent matters, and he received a conclusion that there wasn't too much danger. He also got confirmation that Quiron's suicide was a result of the influence of a Beyonder. After busying himself with all of that, he left the grey fog and returned to the real world and continued waiting for Mr. Azek's reply. On Saturday evening, Klein, who wore a formal suit, arrived at St. Samuel Cathedral with Richardson on a carriage to participate in the charity party. After passing through the main entrance, he was led by a priest to a huge adjacent hall. There was a baldachin with the sacred emblem representing the Evernite goddess placed inside. High above were a few miniature crystal chandeliers that hung down. In front of it were thin and long candles as well as overturned round metal lids used to store wax. At this moment, all of them had been lit, illuminating the hall with brightness. It had quite a holy feeling to it. Klein glanced over and saw a series of neatly arranged seats and guests who wore out of the ordinary attire. Among them, the women mainly wore two types of clothing. One was dresses that were either bright or dark colors, and they were bold and liberal in the dressing, allowing one to see the fair flesh at their bosoms or their shoulders. The other type wore pure and fresh colors in relatively conservative dressing. Even their collar bones could hardly be seen. Some of them even had theirs concealed. Based on what Klein knew, this was the difference between married and unmarried women in the Lowen Kingdom. As for widows and divorced, they could choose between the two. However, the former tended to choose darker colors. Aside from those, Klein also saw shimmering necklaces and exquisite earrings, as well as all kinds of valuable accessories. They were a lot more impressive than what the guests that attended the ball or banquet which Macton himself had hosted. After walking into the hall, Klein greeted the bishops, Macht, and others he knew and exchanged pleasantries. At this moment, there was a sound from the door as many guests turned to look back, revealing their smiles as they walked over. When Klein looked over, his gaze first lit up before it froze. At the entrance to the hall, the most attractive one, there was a girl with lustrous blonde hair that softly cascaded down her shoulders. Her beautiful eyes were green like emeralds. They appeared like the sea which hid a maelstrom within, making anyone who looked at her unable to move their gaze away. Her facial features were pretty, and she had an outstanding bearing. Her looks were nearly flawless, making the men and women present find it difficult to notice what kind of dress she was wearing or the designer of her jewelry. However, Klein had swept his gaze to the necklace at her collarbone. A lustrous and perfect pearl was being embedded within the crevice between the intersection of her collarbone. It softened the lines at her neck, making her accentuate a clean and mesmerizing feel. Klein had met her before and he knew her. She was none other than the Tarot Club's Miss Justice. Back when she used magic mirror divination, Klein had seen her before. Immediately, Klein moved his gaze away, without daring to take another look. This was an instinctive reaction of his, as he knew that Miss Justice was a Beyonder of the spectator pathway. If he garnered her attention, it was very easy for her to read his true thoughts and secrets based on the changes in his expressions and body language. But his racing mind quickly forced him to turn his head back as he continued casting his gaze at Miss Justice. He discovered that him avoiding her had made it worse and more obvious. How could a gentleman who liked all kinds of women not take a few more glances when encountering such an abnormally beautiful lady? At the same time, Audrey sensed the abnormality of a particular man. His sideburns are a little white. His looks and bearing aren't bad, making him appear profound. This is likely Mr. Duane Dantes, who donated more than £10,000 in an attempt to establish a bursary foundation for the poor. His reaction was a little odd, as though he was trying to hide something. To Audrey, Duane Dantes's act of moving his gaze away was actually very normal. She had encountered many similar situations in the past. Some men would indeed subconsciously turn their heads away after seeing her, as though afraid that she would notice it, or that they would make eye contact, exposing their moment of being mesmerized. Therefore, what was odd wasn't that Duane Dantes had moved his gaze away. Instead, he had turned his gaze back again. In addition, Audrey felt that the greatest problem was that the gentleman's emotions were more of shock instead of amazement. What's he shocked about? What is he trying to hide? With her questions, Audrey greeted her parents and brother and the people that gathered over with a faint smile. Seeing Miss Justice no longer paying attention to him, Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief as he began thinking. I need to be careful later and play the role of Duane Dantes well. I mustn't let a spectator notice any problems. Regardless of whether Miss Justice noticed it or not, I've already thought of the excuse for my abnormal reaction. Miss Justice is indeed a lady from a powerful aristocratic family. I wonder what her last name is exactly. I'll ask Macht or Bishop Electra later. Amidst his thoughts, Klein frowned slightly, having a nagging feeling that he was being watched. Following his spiritual intuition, he swept his gaze towards the door. Outside the door in the shadows, there was a golden retriever sitting there silently. When the ghostly gaze of the golden retriever pierced through the curtains from the shadows, Klein's brows indiscernibly twitched as he failed to hide his alarm. He then naturally shifted his gaze away and looked towards Miss Justice and company. How terrifying. Why is that dog sitting in the corner, hiding in the shadows for no good reason? It was silently looking at everyone in the hall. Miss Justice seems to have fed a spectator potion to an animal and had once asked Mr. Hanged Man for advice. Don't tell me it's that golden retriever. 2 spectators, one out in the open, and one in the dark. Which actor can handle that? In high society, Miss Justice and the dog are unlikely to be the only spectators. Her joining the psychology alchemists was a result of other nobles as well. It seems like it was done by Duchess Negan's sister. As Klein lampooned and analyzed, he walked to Mac's family and asked in a seemingly casual manner, the ones who just entered seemed to be very noble people. Macht glanced Duane Dantes and chuckled. Eastchester Earl's family. You can directly call him Earl Hall. You should have heard of him. That's his wife, Ma'am Caitlin. That's his eldest son, Lord Hibbert. You should have already met him. Upon hearing Mac's introduction, Klein suddenly broke out into a cold sweat. This was because he had indeed met Hibbert Hall at the ball Macht had hosted. However, he had failed to notice the Lord, or he wouldn't have raised the question. I was shocked by Miss Justice's sudden appearance. Klein maintained his smile and listening stance. Macht continued, that's his daughter, Miss Audrey Hall. In the social scene over the past 2 years, she has the title of being the most stunning gem in Backland. It's very apt, isn't it? Without waiting for Duane Dantes's reply, he minced his words by saying, she is courted by princes, duke heirs, and many honorable excellencies and gentlemen. Macht's concealed meaning was clear. He was saying to this man, one who liked all kinds of women, not to place his sights on the lady. She was a target he had no thoughts of making contact with. As for Klein, he was having other thoughts. So Miss Justice is Earl Hall's daughter. It's no wonder she's so rich. It's no wonder she's never bargained. Earl Hall is one of the top bankers in the kingdom. He's the most influential member of Parliament of the House of Lords, and one of the hereditary peerage. His wealth is much more than Baron Cindra's. Even if Miss Justice is unable to inherit the aristocratic title and family estate, the wealth she will inherit will be at least £100,000. With her looks, birth, and character, she is indeed the best choice for a marriage partner with the royal family or powerful nobles. However, the way she has been repeatedly buying mystical items doesn't look like she's someone with a wealth of only a few £100,000. She's able to claim it from her father. I also wish to have one like that. Amidst his racing thoughts, Klein replied to Macht's warning with a smile, I've heard of the various rumors about Miss Audrey. It's only today that I have realized that they aren't that exaggerated. Unfortunately, I'm not a prince or the heir to a duke, marquis, viscount, or earl. Otherwise, I would also be one of her pursuers. He was implying that he knew his status and standing. Mac didn't continue the topic and began introducing the various guests he knew to Duane Dantes. He had truly led him into high society. Of course, the greatest supporter involved in this was the Church of Evernite. Without the charity party they held for the foundation, Mac wouldn't have the chance to bring Duane Dantes to meet so many honorable people. Marquis Lowsend, Earl Gross, Viscount Loveland. The aristocratic believers of the goddess separately exchanged pleasantries with Duane Dantes with a rather genial attitude. Before Mac was done with the introductions, an elder walked into the hall. He was wearing a black clergyman robe with red accents. By his chest hung 5 dark sacred emblems. He was clean-shaven, and his eyes were deep, dark, and tranquil. Including Earl Hall, everyone turned to face the elder and respectfully bowed. "Good evening, Your Grace." This elder was none other than St. Anthony Stevenson, one of the 13 archbishops of the Church of Evernite. He was the person in charge of the Backland diocese, and he was part of the upper echelons of the church in the true sense of the word. When Klein saw the archbishop, his body and mind involuntarily trembled as he found it difficult to hide it. It was as though he stumbled upon a grave on an unlit village trail back when he was young. He swept his gaze and saw that the other guests didn't have any strong reactions. He immediately realized that the horror which St. Anthony carried with him was more clearly felt by people with stronger spirituality. He hurriedly entered cogitation in an attempt to calm himself down. When he managed to control his trembling, St. Anthony had already smiled. He surveyed the area and tapped his chest 4 times in a clockwise fashion. "Praise the Lady! Praise the Lady!" the guests at the charity party replied one after another. With the Archbishop's arrival, Mac stopped introducing Klein to the other guests because the party had officially begun. According to convention, everyone would take their seats and piously pray to the goddess for 3 minutes. Following that, the cathedral would begin singing and walk to the Baldachin and use their ethereal, uniform, and seemingly cathartic voices to praise the goddess. After the religious ritual ended, Electra received St. Anthony's instructions to stand to the side of the choir. There was a podium there with all kinds of books placed on it. "Everyone, I'd like to thank you all for coming. Your character is a resplendent star in the serene night." Electra first said a few words of pleasantries before saying, "Our establishment of a bursary foundation that targets the poor stems from Mr. Duane Dantes' suggestion. He is truly an honorable gentleman. His piousness and character are impeccable and a definite role model to others. Next, I'd like to invite Mr. Duane Dantes to give everyone a brief speech." Although Klein was already prepared, he drew a gasp inwardly when he heard the last sentence. This was different from usual. There were 2 or even more spectators around. It wasn't something that he could bullshit through if he wanted to. The content of his speech needed to be sufficiently realistic, without them being able to see through his lies or fake examples. Pressing down his clothes at his abdomen, he quickly stood up and walked to the podium as he buttoned his suit. Coming behind the podium and steadying himself, he surveyed the nobles, members of parliament, clergymen, and high-ranking civil servants. He said with a smile, "I'm a little nervous. This is my first time being stared at by so many people of such honorable standing. I was once active in a region where the poor gathered. I was active in the chaotic southern continent and, thus, saw many things. There was a young lady who helped her mother make pasted matchboxes from the age of 6. If she didn't do that, they wouldn't even have the money to buy rye bread after paying rent. The rye bread they eat is filled with millfeed, and occasionally, they will bite into gravel or rocks. The hardness make it usable as a rod to attack others. When this girl gradually grew up, although she led a laborious daily life, and her family lacked any additional funds, she still looked forward to the night schools run by the church. She wished to study how to read in order to grasp knowledge. This is because she knew that only by doing so could she stop living the way she did. Only by doing so would she not starve and be able to wear clothes that could really protect her from the cold. She wouldn't need to work at factories with harsh conditions and end up dying in her 20s. Klein had selected a portion of the experiences of the poor kids he had met before, merging them together as he conveyed them with his true feelings. He could clearly see many ladies more or less reveal looks of empathy. A number of girls even had their eyes flicker, such as Audrey Hall. "She really is an easily moved child. I've acted from the bottom of my heart. I've even moved myself, much less a spectator. However, most gentlemen aren't moved. Some of them seem to already be aware of the situations of the poor. Some do not mind those of the lower class. Klein swept his gaze as he continued, our industry has been developing. In the future, we will definitely need more literate workers. Our election criteria has been relaxed. In the future, the ones who are eligible to vote will definitely include most of the educated. With the empathy towards these poor children and my expectations of the kingdom's future, I've decided to donate all my coin company shares that I have on hand to establish a bursary foundation that targets the poor. It lets them have the opportunity to enter official institutes of higher learning after attending the free night classes. Earl Hall, who had a beautiful moustache, nodded when he heard that. He was the first to raise his hands to gently clap. Amidst the vigorous applause, Klein returned to the seat belonging to him. Bishop Electra headed up and announced, the shares that Mr. Dwayne Dantes donated are valued at £15,000. We would use it to establish a low-end charity bursary foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, if you agree with him and pity those children who thirst for knowledge, you can contribute to this foundation. As he spoke, he pointed at the donation box beside him. Audrey retracted her gaze and pressed the corner of her eye and said to her father, Father, I plan on donating £1,000. What about you? As she spoke, her mind quickly summarized what she had observed. Dwayne Dantes has likely lived a lower-class life. His pity, empathy, and speech were all very realistic. Those poor children are truly pitiful. Just now, when the bishop mentioned that the shares were valued at £15,000, the corners of his lips twitched unnaturally. From the looks of it, he likely feels the pinch over donating the money. However, the sincerity of him donating it doesn't seem fake. This means that he's a gentleman who loves money, but he loves kindness even more. Why was he shocked when he saw me, and what is he hiding? He has seen me somewhere before but doesn't know my identity. But there's no need to hide that. He identified my necklace as a mystical item, so he was shocked before trying to attempt to hide this matter. If that's the case, it means that he's definitely a Beyonder, one that isn't a low-sequence Beyonder. I'll ask Susie later when I'm back. Perhaps, she noticed other details. She was hiding in the darkness, so he wouldn't be on his guard against her, allowing her to discover more. Amidst her thoughts, Audrey saw her father smile as he took out a checkbook and fountain pen. The value he wrote down was £10,000. £10,000. Audrey blinked as she used a very slight change in expression to express her surprise. Without needing her to voice out her question, Earl Hall had noticed her puzzlement. He chuckled and said, This is an insightful man. His ideas have inspired me and resonated with me. Besides, we can't ignore the misery that objectively exists just because it cannot be resolved anytime soon. Audrey vaguely understood her father, but she felt that she didn't fully understand him. She nodded slightly and took out her checkbook from her purse that matched her dress and wrote down the £1,000 value. This was a charity ball. Furthermore, it was held in a side hall of the cathedral, so there weren't any dances or extravagant arrangements. There weren't any valets or ladies' maids following by their sides. It was simply a charity event that had some degree of donations involved. The ladies undoubtedly brought their bags on them. The guests subsequently threw their checks into the donation box and headed for the two long tables for some beverages or simple food. After which, they walked around the hall socializing instead of sitting. This was closer to that of a buffet party. Klein also accompanied Electra and came to St. Anthony's side and was introduced to him. St. Anthony smiled in response to Dwayne Dantes's greeting. He sized him up and said, Very good. We are proud to have a believer like you. It's the goddess that has taught us that character is more important than status. Therefore, you are an extremely honorable gentleman. To be frank, faced with this saint, Klein's heart was drumming because deities or beyonders related to the fate domain was able to see the grey fog's aura on him. For example, everyone from the monster pathway or the Evernite goddess who wielded the authority of misfortune. As for Saint Anthony, if he was a high-sequence Beyonder of the sleepless pathway and grasped Beyonder powers involving misfortune, then there was a chance that he could see that there was a problem with Dwayne Dantes. As such, Klein had headed above the grey fog to divine Sir before attending the charity party. He received the answer that there wasn't any danger. Since the goddess didn't say anything, even if her archbishop were to discover some problems, he will probably feign ignorance. Klein replied with a warm smile, I've been to the cathedral frequently to pray and listen to Bishop Electra's preachings in recent times. Even my soul seems to have been cleansed. Therefore, I abided by the goddess's teachings to pass such beauty and hope to others. Saint Anthony nodded and said, in front of the goddess, all believers are differentiated by their character, regardless if they are nobles or commoners, male or female. They are all the same. I hope those people who live in poor environments will liberate themselves of fear and receive serenity. Praise the Lady. Klein and Electra tapped their chests 4 times in a clockwise fashion. Praise the Lady. Seeing Saint Anthony turn towards the other believers, Klein planned on heading over to the table to get a glass of champagne to quench his thirst. At this moment, he saw a gentleman approach him. This man had somewhat loose skin with an obvious potbelly. However, it could be seen that he was rather handsome in his youth. Even now, his blue eyes that had a smile on them and his beautiful moustache made him appear good-looking. Klein had previously learned from Mac's introduction and knew he was the House of Lords Member of Parliament and powerful banker, Earl Hall. Of course, to him, the most important identity of this noble was that he was Miss Justice's father. And Audrey happened to be by his side. She was observing Dwayne Dantes with her bright eyes, awaiting her conversation with the gentleman later. This made Klein immediately feel a little uncomfortable. I need to present the persona that matches Dwayne Dantes. A person of ordinary birth who's working hard to get himself into high society. At this moment, he's bound to be a little nervous and restrained. Likewise, a gentleman who loves beautiful women will feel the same feelings when faced with the most stunning gem in Backlund's eyes. But he will also unknowingly showcase his own breadth of knowledge and show his charms to express his desire. Yes, an experienced tycoon who survived the chaos must be someone who has pride and confidence hidden in him. No matter what he faces, he will try his best to appear calm, respectful but not sycophantic. Klein's thoughts raced as he smiled and politely said to the approaching Earl Hall, "Honorable Earl, I happened to see the check you donated. Your kindness and generosity truly impresses me. Yet, you've never flaunted that or informed others how much you've donated." Earl Hall chuckled. "No, compared to you, the price I pay is far inferior to what you made." Between the lines, he meant that £15,000 might be a tenth of Dwayne Dantes's overall wealth or even a fifth, but £10,000 to him was just a thousandth or even lesser. Clearly, the former paid a greater price, and his willingness to do was even more pure. From my point of view, as long as the poor who yearn to use knowledge to change their fates can be helped, all donations are kind and sufficiently benevolent. From this angle, the only difference between £10,000 and £15,000 is just £5,000. Klein tried hard to express his sincerity as he deliberately glanced at the listening blonde girl without leaving a trace. He knew that an ordinary, without a trace, was obvious in the eyes of a spectator. Audrey wore a faint smile as she silently listened to her father's and Dwayne Dantes's conversation, as though she hadn't noticed the gentleman peek at her. This made Klein lack confidence from his failure at receiving any feedback in his performance. Earl Hall laughed and said, "Then we shall agree to disagree. This isn't anything bad. At the very least, we are praising one another. I can tell that you once had a difficult period and had once led the life of the poor." Klein nodded and said, "I do not avoid such a past. They are my valuable riches. And this is something me and my friends lack," Earl Hall commented with a smile. "And it's because of this that you possess a unique and wise point of view. I hope there will be opportunities in the future to work with you." "That is also something I look forward to," Klein replied with a suitable level of sincerity. Earl Hall pointed to the side and said, "A couple of friends are waiting for me. I hope that your charitable ways and wealth keep increasing." Klein didn't drag on the conversation as he drew the crimson moon on his chest. "Praise the Lady. Praise the Lady." Earl Hall and Audrey tapped their chests in a clockwise fashion in unison. Watching them walk past him and in another direction, Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Suddenly, he tensed up as he naturally looked around the hall and noticed the shadow at the door. Silently sitting there was the golden retriever. On the carriage back to Empress Borough, Earl Hall, who looked like he was resting with his eyes closed, looked at his daughter and said, "Audrey, didn't you mention that you wish to join one of the church's charitable organizations? Are you interested in joining this bursary foundation?" Audrey had already sensed that her father might have such thoughts back in the cathedral, so she expressed the appropriate level of surprise and confusion. "It's only a small charity foundation." Audrey's brother, Hibbert Hall, argued for his sister. Earl Hall shook his head and laughed. "I've asked a few bishops. The total amount of donations tonight has already reached £100,000. Why do you think there's so much? Hibbert frowned slightly as he said in thought, they were bribed. At the same time, Audrey gave her own point of view. Knowledge and the relaxing of the electoral qualifications. Earl Hall nodded and sighed. Nothing is an essential existence, including humans themselves as well as the nobility. He then looked at Audrey and said with a smile, there's no need to force yourself. I can get others to join the Bursary Foundation. I just wish that you will gain more knowledge because of this and now view certain matters as definite and immutable. Hey, even if you miss this, there will be other charity organizations. Father, I'll consider it, Audrey replied seriously. After hearing Dwayne Dantes' recount of the stories of the poor, she had already decided on joining to gather more donations, to contact the government, and organize events to contribute her efforts to the cause. She was hesitant because she felt that the middle-aged man was a little problematic. After returning home, Audrey immediately brought Susie to her room and closed the door. What's your take on that Mr. Dwayne Dantes? Audrey asked directly. The golden retriever sat opposite her and thought. He seems to know you or something on you. Also, a lot of the time, he's acting and leaving a certain degree of clues. He seemed to be guarded against me. He's extremely sharp. Yes, I noticed it too. He might be a beyonder. He acted very well, but it's still an act. However, this is also very ordinary. At a social event, and faced with different people, we would all play different roles and engage in a corresponding act, Audrey said in thought. The biggest problem stems from his shock when he saw me. He was almost horrified. Also, he was embroiled in 2 cases, one after another, especially with that case regarding Baron Cindras. It seems to have some beyonder elements involved in it, with signs of someone being cued to do so. Susie gaped her mouth, unable to give a definitive explanation. All she could do was woof. Audrey began another train of thought. I'll get someone to investigate Dwayne Dantes, and after confirming that there aren't any major problems, I'll join the Bursary Foundation. Right, it's almost Monday. I can request Fours and Mr. Moon. They're both in Backland. Monday afternoon at 3. Dark red beams shot up in the Grand Palace, materializing into blurry figures. Audrey quickly surveyed the area and looked to the seat of honor at the bronze, long table and bowed with a smile. Good afternoon, Mr. Fool Tilda. Upon hearing Miss Justice's greeting, the Fool Klein suddenly had a strong wistful feeling. After knowing her identity, status, looks, and situation, he had a deeper understanding as to why Audrey's tone had a happy and radiant air. He understood where they essentially came from, but he didn't end up envious or jealous because of that, nor did he believe that she lacked the toughness that was brought about by misery. Instead, he felt that in this world that had chaos, warped, and madness underlying it, having such a lady exist was really nice. A smile surfaced on his face as he gently nodded as an acknowledgement of Miss Justice's greeting. After the Tarot Club members exchanged greetings, Katlia nudged her glasses and turned her body sideways. She bowed in the direction of the blurry figure that was enveloped by grey fog at the end of the long bronze table. Honorable Mr. Fool, there are 3 diary pages this time. Queen Mystic has finally come online again. Klein lampooned and said with a smile, very good. A few seconds later, Katlia conjured the diary pages after receiving approval before seeing him leap into Mr. Fool's hands. Klein glanced at it casually when his heart skipped a beat. He realized that the diary pages provided by Queen Mystic depicted Emperor Roselle's early days. It didn't seem to contain anything important. Logically speaking, when being unable to distinguish the importance of entries, one will definitely prioritize the later diary entries. This would best restore the mystery as to why Emperor Roselle was agitated. I believe Queen Mystic is sufficiently clever. As Klein wondered to himself inwardly, he began seriously reading the first page. The 21st of September. Arrived at St. Millom. I've officially begun my first state visit. Fazak's weather is really a little cold. It's not even October and it looks like it's about to snow. It's no wonder it's famous for its various coats and winter wear. As well as its liquor. FCK, the people here are ridiculously tall. As expected of a country that descended from giants. However, I have to say that I hate it when people look down on me. Tonight, I'll be going to a bar to find a Fazak beauty to share some drinks. Upon reading this, Klein suddenly suspected if Queen Mystic Bernadette's question was if she had a brother of Fazak descent. Holding back his TS King inwardly, Klein swept his gaze to the second diary entry. The 22nd of September. I think I blacked out. What happened last night? What happened to my Fazak beauty? I actually lost out to her in drinking. The embassy staff told me that the women here are often better at drinking than men. I should show some temperance when I head to bars in the future. I sure don't want some ugly, middle-aged woman to do unspeakable things to me when I black out. The alcohol here sure is strong. My headache has lasted an entire day. Thankfully, my stomach doesn't hurt. I should sleep early. I'll be visiting the Great Twilight Hall tomorrow. The 23rd of September. The Great Twilight Hall is indeed grand. It's like a myth materializing into reality. That building seems to be completely prepared for giants. Since I don't share their faith, I could only circle the perimeter. The square at the bottom of the Great Twilight Hall is also filled with the fragrance of alcohol. There were plenty of people there, some kneeling, some sitting, others playing musical instruments. They exude a rather relaxed and open feeling. I got to know a Phasation who blows a bone flute. Compared to his kinsman, he's ridiculously tall. He's roughly 3 meters tall. His name is Honegger, and he claims to be from one of the clans in Phazak that have the purest giant bloodline. The way he plays the bone flute looks very sorrowful, as though he doesn't belong here but has no idea where to go to. Compared to the skirt chasers at Intis, he's a lot more like a poet. Now that I mention it, I really can't help but give some criticism. Those guys seem to wear any sexual diseases as a badge of honor. It just messes up the entire social market. I had a chat with Honegger for a while and raised my question from before. He said that he's only homesick. But the problem lies in the fact that he's a true blue native from St. Millem. He has never left this place before. Honegger didn't immediately reply to me as he played the bone flute for a few more minutes. He later told me that he misses the origins of the giant bloodline, the giant king's court mentioned in myths. He told me that he and his clan of Phasations often dream of tall mountains that are used as giant city walls. It's a palace forever bathed in twilight's glow, with tall towers and other kinds of buildings. It resembles the Great Twilight Hall, but it's even more fascinating, epic, and miraculous. Without anyone needing to tell them, Honegger and his clansmen believe that it's the giant king's court. Towards the end of our conversation, Honegger slowly stood up and thanked me for listening. He was going to leave Phazak to seek out the giant king's court, to find the home of his soul. He believed that in the zone at the easternmost front of the Sonya Sea, there might be a path that leads to the giant king's court. He said that a millennia has passed, but the giants have never forgotten their home. Now, it's his turn to follow the footsteps of his ancestors. This path would never stop until the destination is reached. He played the bone flute again and gradually left amidst that ethereal and sorrowful tune. Home, home. Upon reading this, Klein felt for the first time that his feelings resonated with the emperor. Although Roselle only wrote the word that seemed to repeat without describing his feelings, Klein could understand the undulating feelings within the emperor. This was because he and Roselle were like Honegger. They had a home they belonged to spiritually. Sighing inwardly, Klein flipped to the second diary page. The 10th of January. Visited Sonya Island. This place is also called Ancient Elf Island. It has plenty of elvish ruins and customs left over. I was surprised on the first day. The elves actually make blood cake, and they enjoy eating animal organs and are good at using spices. They even invented chopsticks. Thinking about the elvish depictions on the murals, apart from the blue hair, their facial contours and eyes are similar to Asians on Earth. Could they be my fellow countrymen? Yes, back then, I had such suspicions as well. However, it's impossible for so many people to transmigrate at once since it's almost an entire race. I felt that I was overthinking matters. But it doesn't make sense that the customs and cutlery that appears on Earth won't appear here. Klein thought in interest as he quickly continued reading. He wanted to know if Roselle had gotten to the bottom of it. The 13th of January. I've been so busy searching for writings, relics, and folk tales that I forgot to write my diary for a few days. Although many objects have been taken away by the various churches, I've still obtained something of value. Various legends have it that Elf King Sonyathrin created chopsticks. There are records of him using animal organs and blood to cook delicacies. There are stories of this ancient god being good at identifying and using spices. It's acknowledged that he is their founding ancestor, the first elf. Due to certain reasons, he led the race and left the western continent that only existed in legends, bringing them to the northern continent. Could it be that this is a fellow countryman of mine, a transmigrator? He later produced an entire race. There's nothing ancient gods can't do, including having children. He apparently had a wife who was also an elf. I'll need to think this through. The 16th of January. After further investigation, elves might really have nothing to do with transmigrators. At the very least, they didn't leave behind any Chinese, English, or other symbols. They have likely been using Elvish all the time. Nothing of it gives me a sense of familiarity. Furthermore, the inventions we have in common didn't appear before I came. Likewise for famous quotes. There are only proverbs and idioms with similar meanings but with a completely different choice of words. From all the items and legends I have now, none of them support my theory. This is a little disappointing, but it also makes me relieved. If I were to encounter another transmigrator or other transmigrators, I really have no idea how to face them. The 17th of January. I dreamed of the home I've nearly forgotten. Indeed, the Emperor more or less gave up on that theory. Klein flipped to the next page and saw the final diary entry. The 2nd of April. My daughter is smart. She can speak before the age of 1. Although she has only learned a few words, I believe that her subsequent development can't be slow. She must have inherited this from me. No matter how I look, she looks a little like how I looked like on Earth. Could it be that a soul will also bring about some level of inheritance? Haha, I'll just treat it as so. Bernadette, this name is quite good. It sounds beautiful, but deep in my heart, I keep having the urge to give her a Chinese nickname. Sigh, she won't get to see her real grandmother and grandfather. The 3rd of April. I suffered from insomnia last night because of the wistful thoughts I suddenly had yesterday. Thankfully, I know cogitation. However, this also made me consider a problem. That is whether I should secretly teach Bernadette Chinese. No, I can't. If she were to understand the diary entries her father had previously written, I'd rather kill myself. In my daughter's heart, her father is filled with honor. However, using Chinese to write my diary is my final tether to Earth and my past. My daughter should inherit this tether to a certain extent. The 6th of April. After a few days of consideration, I've decided to teach Bernadette 2 Chinese characters as though they are special symbols. I'll tell her that this is a protective incantation that her father is giving her and that she is to remember it forever. She doesn't need to know the corresponding meaning. All she needs to do is to remember it. The word in Chinese is home. Home. Klein repeated this word again as he felt his eyes redden a little. He finally understood why Queen Mystic had chosen these 3 diary pages. This was because it was the protective symbol her father had left her. Home. At this moment, Klein seemed to see a river of emotions. Its surface was flowing silently, but there were infinite eddies flowing underneath, churning without end. Klein retracted his gaze and made the diary pages disappear. Looking up at Katlia, he asked, "What's your question?" When looking at Katlia, Klein had actually guessed what her request would be as he sighed and felt confident. How did Mr. Fool know that I'll be asking a question and not making a request? As expected of Mr. Fool. Katlia thought before politely asking, "Honorable Mr. Fool, I would like to know the meaning of these 2 symbols." After receiving permission, she conjured the Chinese characters. They were Gu and Xiang. As expected, Klein sighed silently. When combined together, they mean home, the homeland for one's soul. When combined together, the homeland for one's soul. Katlia placed the emphasis on the second sentence because she knew very well where home was for Queen Mystic, nor did she believe that it was anything special. Audrey, Alger, and the other Tarot Club members took the opportunity to learn the new Roselle text and tried hard to memorize the symbols and the combined meaning, except Eric. Klein didn't speak further as he leaned back into his chair. "You may begin." Alger immediately turned his head and looked at the world. "Your mystical item is ready. I'll give it to you this week." He was referring to the mystical item made from an ocean songster's beyond a characteristic. The artisan had first rushed to finish Miss Justice's glove. As for the world's request, it had been delayed until this week. With Mr. Azek not replying yet, and with me unable to restore the seal on Creeping Hunger, this mystical item's arrival is timely. Klein controlled the world and made him nod. That's still an acceptable speed. An acceptable speed. If I had delayed it for another 2 to 3 weeks or even a year, would you be teleporting to me? Alger thought with a baffling sense of wariness. As his original plan was to obtain the cataclysmic Intera potion from the church, and with him just beginning to digest the ocean songster potion, he wasn't looking to purchase any corresponding Beyonder ingredients. He fell silent again and began watching the other members begin their transactions. To Alger, the most important thing now was to obtain 1 or 2 mystical items to match with Whip of Mind. After all, although mystical items were more about quality than quantity, with the need to avoid having the negative effects stacking with each other, to only have one mystical item for a Sequence 5 Beyonder was quite an embarrassment. Under normal circumstances, Sequence 5 Beyonders would have 2 or 3 mystical items whose negative effects didn't overlap, making them the best combination. Of course, Alger had already reserved one. Once the artisan finished the world's item, it would be his 6-winged gargoyle's core crystal. For that, he needed to pay £1,000. Together with the fee he needed to pay for the world, the little amount of money he had was reduced by £2,000, leaving him with £1,800. Out of that, £500 was a commission he had earned from Miss Justice's glove. With no one speaking, Emlyn looked at the sun and asked after some deliberation, "I need a Sequence 5's artificial vampires beyond a characteristic. What do you wish to get in exchange?" In recent times, he had learned that the Sanguine had the means to eliminate the mental corruption of a Beyonder characteristic, but he needed to make sufficient contributions to make an application. Therefore, Emlyn wished to first obtain the main ingredient needed for advancement before considering the other problems. Based on his observations, such a Sequence 5 artificial vampire beyond a characteristic roughly cost £8,000 based on Mr. World's pricing. As for himself, he only had £5,400 and was still a little short. Based on Emlyn's original thoughts and habits, he needed to save up £8,000 before requesting a trade with the Sun. He wasn't a sanguine who liked to buy things on credit, even for the newest and best doll. Nor could he thicken his skin to borrow from others. All he would do is be more frugal, work harder, and save up more. However, he quickly realized something. The Sun didn't accept cash. To the residents of the City of Silver, Lowen's cash was no different from scrap paper. Therefore, Emlyn believed that the Sun would make a request for an item, so it was better to learn of it to prepare it ahead of time. Furthermore, the Sun doesn't understand the market prices. Perhaps the thing he wants only costs £5,000. In the hopes of being pleasantly surprised, Emlyn lifted his chin slightly and looked at the Sun beside him. Derek thought seriously and said, Sun Pathways Sequence 5 Potion Formula. He originally wished to request him to repay his debt with Mr. World, but he realized that Mr. World hadn't raised any requests at all. Hence, he didn't find it appropriate to relegate it to someone else. In addition, having participated in so many tarot gatherings, Derek was no longer the newcomer who knew nothing. With the City of Silver having an exchange standard, he knew the difference between a Sequence 6 Notary Potion Formula and a Sequence 5 Beyonder characteristic very well. Using the former to cover the debt of the latter would be a terrible deal, therefore, he changed his request to the Sequence 5 Potion Formula. Sequence 5 Potion Formula. That's very difficult to purchase. It will cost between £4,500 to £7,000. It will mainly depend on how urgent both parties are. Also, there's a cost to verifying its authenticity too. Emlyn was just about to answer when he heard Mr. World's hoarse voice sound, "I have it." Instantly, the palace that looked like a giant's residence fell silent. All the Tarot Club members appeared a little wooden. Is Sequence 5 that common? Emlyn felt down when he realized that he still wasn't at Sequence 5 yet. After calming down, he asked, "How much will it cost?" Considering Emlyn White's financial situation, Klein made the world chortle deeply. £5,000. Priest of Light Potion Formula. £5,000. Emlyn was first taken aback before he said without hesitation, "Deal." It was like he was facing a discount for a doll he had been longing for. All right. The world nodded as though it wasn't a major transaction. Then, he saw Miss Justice look around and hear her say, "I'd like to commission an investigation mission." Investigation mission. The fool Klein's heart skipped a beat as the world's expression turned somewhat sluggish. "What is it?" Foles asked proactively. Her impression of Miss Justice's commissions was that they were relatively simple while paying handsomely. She definitely needed to take it. Audrey organized her words and said, "There have been 2 matters that happened in Backland recently. One is Baron Cindras. He was suspected to have been framed. The other is Member of Parliament Mac being assaulted because of the environmental measures." Foles found Miss Justice's description especially familiar because she had been present for the 2 matters. She had witnessed them and was involved in them. She unknowingly straightened her back, waiting for Miss Justice to continue. "And in these 2 matters, there is a tycoon named Dwayne Dantes involved." He came to Backland 2 months ago, and he had donated more than £10,000 of shares to the Church of Evernite in an attempt to establish a bursary foundation that targets the poor. Audrey described using a tone as though she had never directly interacted with him and was simply suspecting something about him from the data and rumors she had received. I wish to hire someone to investigate the actual situation with that gentleman. I know this too well. He's rather rich and he looks pretty good. He handles matters with experience and in a mature manner. He's someone with kidney or bladder problems. Fors nearly raised her hand to shout out her thoughts. If Miss Justice wasn't pleased with that, she had even more information, such as Dwayne Dantes was in a rather pitiful state. His butler studied black magic, his servant worshipped death, and one of his neighbors was a beyonder. There was a secret to his street and that he had donated the shares to extricate himself from trouble. In short, he perfectly fits the image of a foreigner who is being bullied. I nearly recommended him a medicine that treats kidney and bladder problems. After all, Mr. Moon is skilled in such matters. I can still earn a commission through this. Yes, there's no rush. Let's hear what Miss Justice has to offer. Fors curbed her heart, which was awash with excitement as she patiently looked at the girl beside her. However, her body language and emotional upheavals had betrayed her in front of a spectator. Audrey was rather surprised and puzzled by this. She never expected Fors to know Dwayne Dantes and seemed to know quite a lot about him. This made her have a new guess as to why Dwayne Dantes was shocked when he saw her. She suspected if Fors had once said or shown something to the man. Meanwhile, Emlyn was a blank. He knew nothing about what Miss Justice had mentioned. All he could do was confirm that these happened in Backland. As for the fool Klein, who was leaning back in his chair, leisurely looking at the members, he nearly twitched the corners of his mouth. Miss Justice's commissioning of others to investigate Dwayne Dantes had exceeded his expectations. This was because they had only met once at the charity party. They didn't seem to have any deeper interactions, so there was no need for any further investigations. Could it be that I exposed something about myself that garnered Miss Justice's interest? Or could it be that by donating £10,000, it shows how much importance Earl Hall places on this? Hence, Miss Justice decided to secretly carry out investigations because she's worried for her father. Klein's mind raced as he hurriedly thought of a solution. At this moment, Audrey deliberated for a moment and looked at Miss Magician and said, "An initial investigation for £500. If you encounter danger, causing the difficulty to rise, I'll compensate you with more." "No problem." Fors hurriedly organized her words inwardly. Just as she was about to say something, she saw the World Gairman Sparrow raise his hand. He had raised his hand. Fors was taken aback, suspecting that she had seen wrong. Following that, she couldn't help but have thoughts surface in her mind. Mr. World wishes to take this mission. That's right. He's in Backland. But this is an investigation, not a murder. Dwayne Dantes is already pitiful enough. Leave Dwayne alone. Eliminating the investigation target implies completing the investigation. Because there will be no need to make another investigation. What do I do? Do I still take the mission? It's a full £500. I just need to recount what I previously discovered to receive £200, but the competitor is Mr. World. Perhaps we can cooperate and not compete. Why would Mr. World be interested in this mission? His focus is actually on the framing of Baron Syndras or the assault on Member of Parliament Macht. Fors finally grasped the problem at its core. As for Alger and Katlia, they had already cast their gaze at the world. To them, be it the framing of Baron Syndras, the assault on Member of Parliament Macht, or Dwayne Dantes's donation of more than £10,000, they weren't something that needed special notice. However, to have Mr. Fool's Blessed choose to accept the investigation mission meant that the problem was bound to be extremely complicated. It made him feel that there were important secrets underlying the matter. Emlyn didn't think too much about it, but he had also sensed that the seemingly ordinary investigation mission wasn't that simple. His plans on earning some pocket money to make up for the £5,000 that he had just lost were overturned as he suddenly didn't want to say a word. Dwayne Dantes is really something. There must be a big problem with him that makes Mr. World choose to investigate him. Or are those two cases more important and more critical than I imagined? Audrey's mind stirred as she turned her eyes, and she used the advantage of her seating position to take in all the reactions of the Tarot Club members. Among them, Derek was the only exception. To him, wasn't it normal for the Tarot Club to help each other? If someone gave a mission and one was capable of completing it, wasn't it normal to take it? Audrey moved her gaze to the world and asked with hidden anticipation, "Mr. World, you wish to receive this mission?" After returning to Backland, she had gathered up the news at sea over the past few months, roughly confirming that Mr. World was the crazy adventurer, Gairman Sparrow. While she was deeply impressed by this seemingly polite but dangerous gentleman who had accomplished many great deeds, she felt that her feelings to adventure out at sea had waned. Klein had already thought of a response. He had controlled the world to lower his hand and wait for Miss Justice to ask. At this moment, he made Gairman Sparrow's expression turn solemn and reply with a deep voice, "Dwayne Dantes is an identity." After a period of brief but repeated considerations, Klein decided to expose some information. He made Dwayne Dantes be one of his public facades as a blessed. He believed if he chose to conceal the matter, there was a chance of being exposed in the future. This was because Dwayne Dantes was about to enter Backland's high society. He could find clues to the Great Smog of Backland or other cases. This way, he might very well need Miss Justice to provide him with assistance. When that happens, the spectator would probably sense something and discover that the world was previously hiding something and that Mr. Fool had never mentioned it. This would lower her sense of belonging and make her even begin suspecting even more matters, causing her faith in the Fool to be borderline dangerous. With two members not knowing each other, or knowing of the other's existence, to tacitly work together to complete a specified mission together to accomplish a complete goal sounded perfect, but in reality, its success was very difficult. Even more so, there was no way he could fool her. Therefore, most of the time, honesty was more effective and less worrisome than lying. As for why he didn't directly say that Dantes was Gairman Sparrow, it was because Klein didn't wish to leave the Tarot Club members the impression as to why it was the same person again. He didn't want them to have the impression that he was the only blessed of Mr. Fool that appeared. Dwayne Dantes is only an identity. Audrey sharply read between the lines and had a theory. Then, she heard the world simply say, "A common identity that me and my companions share. I will occasionally disguise myself as him." Upon saying that, he emotionlessly swept his gaze across the magician. A common identity. Occasionally disguise as him. That very pitiful Dwayne Dantes is Mr. World. That tycoon with kidney or bladder problems is Mr. Gairman Sparrow. Falls felt as though she was struck by lightning as she froze up. Her brain turned numb as she felt struck with fear, subconsciously feeling that Zio's unintentional comment made a lot of sense. When a butler, valet, neighbor, and surroundings had problems, the person that seemed ordinary definitely wouldn't be ordinary. No, it's not the street where Dwayne Dantes stays at, or that he happened to hire a butler with a secret, it's because of that secret that he was selected by Dwayne Dantes, selected by Gairman Sparrow. The pitiful one isn't Dwayne Dantes but the Beyonders and Beyonder items around him. I was wrong. I shouldn't have gotten Zio to ask the goddess to bless him. It's more of a curse for Mr. World. Force suddenly trembled, thankful that she hadn't left a comment in her note that Dwayne Dantes should check on his kidneys or bladder. Otherwise, she suspected that she wouldn't be able to participate in the next tarot gathering. Or perhaps, she would appear in the form of a Beyonder characteristic, sold to the other members by the world. Logically speaking, Mr. World shouldn't know that I'm the magician, but I was carrying Leymano's travels with me. He had used the spellbook before and had added demigod-level Beyonder powers to it. He had definitely observed me in secret, remembering my appearance and evaluating my value. The fear in Fours was surging like a tumultuous sea as her expression was filled with misery. At this moment, she saw Mr. World sweep his cold glance at her, her feelings of regret instantly becoming that of extreme regret. Thankfully, I didn't rush to answer and mention my impression of Dwayne Dantes. When Fours gradually calmed down from her horror, she couldn't help but think of another problem. During the bodyguard mission, were we the ones protecting Dwayne Dantes, or was Dwayne Dantes protecting us? Should I refund Mr. Gairman Sparrow his money? At times, Dwayne Dantes is equivalent to Mr. World. Audrey was first stunned before finding all her questions answered. Fours does know Dwayne Dantes, but she didn't know that he's Mr. World. It can be proven from her shocked reaction just now. The reason that Dwayne Dantes was shocked when he saw me was because he recognized Lie. Although this mystical item has changed, it comes from a Beyonder characteristic that Mr. World provided. Perhaps this crazy adventurer can sense it somehow. After all, Gairman Sparrow can transform into anyone with the powers of shape-shifting. Although I only asked Mr. Hanged Man what will happen when an animal consumes a potion, the potion ingredients I gathered later were always in pairs. Mr. World might very well have guessed that I have a spectator beside me based on that, hence, he became wary against Susie, who was secretly observing everyone in the hall. Others might not doubt an animal, but Mr. World is experienced. He must have interacted with beyonder creatures, so it's very normal for him to be wary against such things. Which is to say, Dwayne Dantes, no, Mr. World. Gairman Sparrow knew that I was Justice, but he didn't choose to make contact or communicate with me. There's nothing wrong with his choice of actions. Under those circumstances, unless he directly says it, it will be difficult for me to guess or believe it. Furthermore, talking about the Tarot Club in St. Samuel Cathedral is just too crazy. After a brief moment of surprise, Audrey's emotions calmed down, leaving her only with excitement. Apart from the magician Fours who she introduced, this was her first meeting with another member of the Tarot Club. It feels like a historic moment. Yes, Mr. World as well as Mr. Fool's other blessed. They should also be considered the world. But why was the identity of Dwayne Dantes made? What are they up to? The matter of Baron Cindras being framed, Member of Parliament Mact being assaulted, and the donation to establish a bursary foundation really are more complicated and important than I originally imagined. Why do I feel that the kingdom's upper echelons are beginning to stir in a state of unrest? I had this feeling back when Prince Edisarch died during the Great Smog of Backland. Today, it's even more intense. Now that I know the identity of Dwayne Dantes, I might be able to participate and cooperate indirectly, reducing the risk my parents might suffer, reducing the risk of the innocent. Amidst her thoughts, Audrey quickly made up her mind. She would accept her father's choice to join the Loan Charity Bursary Foundation. Then she inwardly quipped, wouldn't it be very logical to have Justice from the Tarot Club join the charity foundation established by Mr. World from the Tarot Club? Alger and Catlia weren't too surprised that Dwayne Dantes was the world, that he was the amalgamation of Mr. Fool's blessed. In their minds, another thought flashed through their minds, something major is about to happen in Backland. Is something brewing in Backland again? An extension of the Great Smog of Backland. As Alger and Catlia wondered about the framing of Baron Cindras and the assault on Member of Parliament Mact, they planned on using their own respective channels to obtain more detailed information to see if they could discover anything abnormal. They weren't in a rush. They had no intention to directly ask the world what his motives or exact plans were. They felt that he wouldn't answer in detail. At best, he would just make a comment. Therefore, they planned to gather more information first to do some preliminary investigations. They would then decide on their subsequent course of action depending on the exact situation. At the same time, they suddenly realized that the public announcement of the identity of Dwayne Dantes seemed to be a boon for them. As long as they paid attention to news of the tycoon, they could roughly grasp the actions of Mr. Fool's blessed, and from there, they could provide tacit cooperation or help. And since this was just a fake identity, it could be disposed of the moment any problems were exposed. Similarly, they could be a witness for this identity, making Dwayne Dantes appear more realistic. The simplest example was that if this tycoon had a background at sea, Catlia could provide her crew, friends, and partners the relevant information, making them believe that such a man existed. By the time the official organizations attempted to investigate Dwayne Dantes' origins, they would discover that he did exist and that those matters did happen. After a brief silence, Audrey was just about to answer Mr. World's question when she saw Mr. Moon sit up straight and look to the end of the long bronze table, taking the initiative to ask, what is this public identity used for? Are there deeper problems present in the cases mentioned by Miss Justice? As a citizen of Backland, Emlyn was quite concerned about his living environment. Why don't you investigate all these questions yourself? To not be swept into the vortex, I have already exposed myself. Klein lampooned Emlyn and made the world give a deep chuckle. Of course. It's awaiting further investigation. His succinct answer could be translated in detail to, the two cases definitely have deeper problems, but that's a secret. I don't plan on telling you. Likewise, don't ask about the purpose of the identity of Dwayne Dantes. Although Emlyn was quite bad at reading people, he could still understand what the world was getting at. He chuckled dryly and leaned back, pretending as though he was very pleased with the answer. When Audrey saw this, she used a second to stop the corners of her mouth from curling up. Then, she said to the world, "All right, I understand. Thank you for the information." At this moment, she was further convinced that joining the Loan Charity Bursary Foundation was a good thing for her. In the future, if she were to face any danger or had any matters she couldn't handle herself, she could inform Mr. World ahead of time. Then, she could head to the Foundation as per normal, busying herself in the office adjacent to Dwayne Dantes's. If the psychology alchemists have their suspicions about me, or if they use a mission to test me, I'll get them to meet me at the Foundation. Dwayne Dantes's image is completely different from the way he acts as the world above the grey fog. Yes, Mr. World is an experienced actor. Also, Dwayne Dantes is a public identity. He won't always be synonymous to Gairman Sparrow. It's no wonder there are rumors of him liking a wide range of women. A crazy murderer and adventurer like Gairman Sparrow definitely is a good match with a pure and innocent girl. As a spectator, Audrey couldn't help but imagine that. As for Klein, he couldn't help but lampoon when he heard her reply. What do you mean, thank you for the information? Shouldn't you be paying £500 in investigation fees? Are you treating it as something shared among members? He made the World nod without further mentioning the matter of Dwayne Dantes. He then turned to look at Little Son. Do you have Bizarro Baines over there? The World paused and added, perhaps you use a different name to refer to it. In short, it's good at disguising itself, and it has bizarre powers. It's nearly at the demigod level and has a main eye gathered from its characteristic. He deliberately mentioned that it was nearly at the demigod level, not to flaunt the fact to him, but to warn Little Son that this was a very dangerous monster. However, Alger and Katlia didn't pay attention to this point. As a representative of Mr. Fool's Blessed, it was very understandable for the World to purchase demigod-level materials on behalf of his peers. Besides, even if he was preparing it for himself, it wasn't anything astonishing. Gairman Sparrow was already a Sequence 5. It was very common for one to gather the ingredients ahead of time. Without realizing it, they felt that Mr. World's advancement from Sequence 5 was seemingly a good thing. Derek thought and said, it's not among the commonly seen monsters, but perhaps someone might have encountered it before. I will search through the books or help you ask. The World tersely answered and fell silent. After Fours made her request, to buy an ancient wraith's cursed artifact and remnant spirituality, to no avail, the transactions came to an end. Before Mr. Hanged Man could ask the Sun, Fours stole a glance at the World and said, I recently had a strange dream. In it was an almost genuine treasure trove, including. She described, in detail, the scene she had seen, and towards the end, she said, that is the complicated symbol formed from fate and concealment. Fours was just about to look towards Mr. Fool to request permission to conjure it when she heard the World say, are you talking about this symbol? The World first made a request before conjuring the symbol. The badge was only the size of an eyeball. On the surface, there were symbols that symbolized fate and concealment. It came from Lanevis, and it was the proof of admission to the Hermits of Fate's gathering. However, Klein had never made any attempts to participate in it before. Fours glanced at it and stammered a reply. Yes, that's it. After she answered it, she realized that Mr. World hadn't only produced the symbol, but he had also produced an item. Suddenly, she came to a realization. Dwayne Dantes had chosen Bockland Street for a reason. Just as she had the thought, she saw the World say with a hoarse voice, that treasure is a trap. He does know, thankfully, I was wise to seek the advice of the experienced. Fours heaved a sigh of relief as she smiled. Thank you for your reminder. Audrey asked out of curiosity, Mr. World, what does that symbol represent? Why do you call it a trap? Klein controlled the World and answered simply, it represents a bunch of thieves that called themselves Hermits of Fate. Hermits of Fate. Thieves? Alger and Katlia thought as they memorized the two names. Based on their own knowledge, they had a certain guess. The former suspected that it was an organization established by a bunch of marauders. The latter believed that an ancient family from the Fourth Epoch was involved. After some careful recalling, Emlyn White confirmed that he had never heard of such an organization, and he planned on learning more from the upper echelons of the Sanguine. As for Klein, he thought of another problem. That demigod from the Marauder pathway who was sealed deep in the sewers hasn't left Bockland Street as expected. He might be hiding at Hazel's place. Furthermore, this demigod isn't staying put. He actually tried to influence Miss Magician via a dream. This won't do. I can't give him free rein to do as he wishes. I have to eliminate this latent risk as soon as possible. I'll find my dear poet later and warn him. The grandpa inside his body wouldn't be uninterested in a demigod of the same pathway. With this in mind, Mr. Fool, who was leisurely looking at the members, curled his mouth into a smile. Audrey vaguely sensed the emotional changes of Mr. Fool as she mumbled inwardly. That bunch of thieves who call themselves Hermits of Fate are friends related to Mr. Fool. The talk about the treasure in the dream quickly came to an end. Katlia thought of something and said to the world, "I'll give you the intelligence you want this week." At this moment, she was a little curious as to why he needed information on West Balam. However, she wasn't the sun or the moon who would ask the moment they didn't know something. She was more accustomed to do a search for clues first. All right. The world nodded. Klein sighed inwardly. With this secret organization, many things were indeed much simpler. Seeing that he had nothing else to say, Alger turned to look at the sun. "Have you figured out the matter regarding your former chief's mausoleum?" Derek said, somewhat ashamed. "I just made 2 friends. As a Beyonder from the Sun pathway, he won less than 1 in 10 matches when in combat at the training field. After suffering plenty of beatings, he finally established a relationship with his former acquaintances. However, the ones he could call friends only numbered 2. Without waiting for the hanged man to answer him, he hurriedly added, "However, I heard that the 6-member council wishes to open the mausoleum. Regardless, they wish to retrieve the characteristic at the very least. In the City of Silver, no one felt that such an operation was problematic. To them, being wasteful was a sin." Alger nodded gently as he changed his admonishing words he was about to say. "Not bad. They don't necessarily have to be friends in order to provide you with help. When you establish a bigger network, you will naturally obtain more intel." Upon gaining recognition, Derek was taken aback for 2 seconds. His shame lessened as he said, somewhat embarrassed, "I will take further steps to understand this matter. I will work hard to make 2 sources of information, no, a friend before the next tarot gathering." Derek quickly made a target for himself. Upon seeing this, Klein made the world hoarsely say, "If it involves the domain of death, you can seek my advice. And I can seek Mr. Azek's advice," he silently added. As for Frank Lee's new mushrooms, he had no plans on transferring them to Little Sun, as they were still incomplete. The fruits that were eventually produced were filled with poison and madness. "Thank you, Mr. World," Derek answered gratefully. After a short exchange regarding other matters, the Tarot Club entered the learning segment until it ended. Returning to the real world, Klein immediately wanted to resolve the problem of the marauder demigod, but the plan he conceived of was met with an obstacle at the first step. He had no idea where to find Leonard Mitchell and the grandpa inside his body. St. Samuel Cathedral. Leonard is most probably underground, but I have no way of entering. He only prays in the cathedral once or twice a week, and he doesn't do it at a fixed time. I can't be heading there thrice a day all week just to meet him, right? What kind of crappy plot is this? Is this what's called a stakeout? Even if I really did it, it might not be effective. As a Red Glove, he might have left Backland. As Klein lampooned, he felt a deep sense of regret. He regretted being too focused on the sophistry and in fooling Leonard Mitchell, thus forgetting to ask for his contact method. I should have said to Leonard, "I will inform Klein Moretti about his identity being exposed. If he has anything he wishes to say, I will pass it on for him. That way, I'll be able to establish a private method of contact." Klein exhaled slowly. All he could do was use his final solution. That was to ask the magic mirror. Drawing the symbols that implied concealment and mystery prying, Klein cast his gaze at the full-body mirror. He saw aqueous light ripple, producing white Loanese text, "Exalted Great Master, your puny, loyal and humble, terrified servant, Erodes, is here to answer your summoning. Before answering any questions, I want to say, I was wrong. I was wrong." Klein pricked up his brows and asked, "Why are you suddenly admitting to a mistake?" On the mirror, the white Loanese words warped and turned into new words. "In short, I was wrong." After a series of ellipses, the white words trembled into shape. "Recently, there have been many people trying to find out about you, and they have learned of the reputation of your present identity. So, Dwayne Dantes' amorous preference of liking anyone beautiful has spread, so much so that even Miss Justice knows of it. Well, that's good. I use the explanation that it's a shared identity. More than one blessed plays as Dwayne Dantes, so having a myriad of preferences can be explained. Hee, look at this mirror. It's scared white." Klein was somewhat enlightened as he secretly laughed before saying, "It's your turn to ask." The full-body mirror's words remained white as it formed new words. "Will you forgive me?" "No, I mean, are you willing to watch my subsequent performance?" This attitude. Klein tsked inwardly and said with a sullen expression, "Work hard." "Yes, great master." The mirror surface's ghastly white words bloomed with silver light. "Since you have summoned me, do you have a question to ask me?" Klein nodded. "Yes. Where will Leonard Mitchell be living in the next few days? The silver marks distorted quickly, forming new words. 7 Pinster Street. Beneath the words, the aqueous light rippled, forming a scene. It was a terrace house numbered Unit 7. There was a black-haired, green-eyed youth just about to get his keys. It's the same old place. There hasn't been any change. If I were to pay a visit directly, it will sully Leonard's impression of Dwayne Dantes. It will be quite a step down. Get Emlyn White to go. Leonard has probably figured out that the vampire and Sherlock Moriarty, who is also Klein Moretti, have ties. The current problem is that it's hard to determine that Grandpa's stance. I have no way of confirming his true motives. Giving him a big gift based on his present state might not be appropriate. Perhaps it will bring extreme danger to Leonard. As it doesn't involve myself, doing a divination above the grey fog won't be effective. Thoughts arose in Klein's mind as he changed his plans. Compared to directly informing the grandpa in Leonard's body about the marauder demigod, using Pallas Zoroaster's or Amon's name to warn the target to force him to leave the area was a milder method that led to fewer repercussions. Of course, the premise is that I don't expose myself. Klein pondered for a few seconds and asked again, where is the demigod beside Hazel Macht hiding? The mirror's surface had aqueous light ripple out as the scene changed. On a thick carpet with beautiful embroidery, there was a small leather sofa. On the surface of the single-seater was a white, furry cushion. In the middle of it was a grey rat. Compared to its kind, its eyes were closer to dark red. Rat. That marauder demigod has parasitized a rat. And he's sleeping inside Hazel's room in broad daylight. He got himself what looks like a very expensive cushion. He had to transform into this because I foiled his plans. Klein was surprised before he felt a little amused. The scene fixed as silver lines surfaced. Great master, what other instructions do you have for me? Very sharp. Klein tersely answered and said, use the mirror in the room to warn that demigod. Tell him that all around this street there is an angel from the marauder pathway with ill intentions plying it. Furthermore, blasphemer Amon might come at any time. All right, master. I'll do it immediately. The words on the mirror sparkled. In Hazel's room, the grey rat felt his spiritual perception stirred as he hurriedly stood up and cast his gaze on the full-body mirror in the room. On the surface of the mirror, words that seemed to be written with fresh blood that had yet to coagulate appeared. Leave this area. The grey rat's gaze froze for a second as it fell silent for a moment. Why? The blood seemed to flow as the words spread out and formed new words. The surrounding area has an angel from the marauder pathway in urgent need of replenishment plying it. This pathway is the nemesis of all high-sequence beyonders. Blasphemer Amon is rushing over. I'm warning you because I do not wish for them to benefit. The grey rat squeaked softly before asking in a deep voice, who are you? It was extremely frustrated that the strength it accumulated would often be forced to be drained. Otherwise, it could use astromancy to confirm the situation. The full-body mirror, which had dimmed at some point in time, suddenly had bloody words appear again, presenting new information. I've already answered one question of yours. Based on the principle of reciprocity, it's my turn to ask. Following that, a new line of bloody red text appeared underneath. After you hurriedly parasitized a rat, you should be influenced by the body's construct and hormones. Now, which entity will make you have the desire to mate? Female human, female rat, or all of the above? Please answer. At this moment, Hazel cracked open the door. And for some reason, the grey rat inside didn't notice it, seemingly affected by something. The door opened slightly again as Hazel discovered that the entity who claimed to be a demigod that existed in legends was staring at the mirror in a daze. It seemed infatuated with its present appearance, a grey rat. Ah! Hazel's brows twitched slightly as she subconsciously paused her action of opening the door. Then, she saw the grey rat's body tremble, its red eyes effusing a clear murderous look. Stop fooling around with me, the grey rat growled. It turned its head to leave the room, but invisible chains suddenly bound its rat's body. This strength wasn't anything for it to fear when it was in its optimal state, but now, everything it had accumulated had been drained. The latest action was to infuse a dream to the beyond bodyguard whom Dwayne Dantes had hired. Boom! A thick, silver bolt of lightning descended down from the sky, smiting the grey rat. The scene before Hazel's eyes turned blinding white as she couldn't see anything. Immediately, her vision recovered as she found the grey rat on the ground, charred black. Its limbs were twitching. What happened? The sudden change made the inexperienced Hazel momentarily lost as to how to react. She stood there in dazed silence for a few seconds before pushing open the door and rushing in. When she arrived beside the charred rat, the existence that claimed to be a demigod rolled in a fit, speaking with a calm tone, "You forgot to close the door." Hazel first wore a blank look before realizing that she had failed to close the door like she usually did because of her eagerness to access the situation. Doing so prevented the maids from peeping in. With the rat appearing fine, Hazel pursed her lips and turned around, walking back to the door. During this process, she didn't forget to glance at the full-body mirror. She saw that everything in it looked normal without any problems. It clearly reflected everything in the room. There weren't any additional people or objects. As the door clicked shut, Hazel asked, "Teacher, what happened just now?" The charred rat looked at her sideways as it cast its gaze beyond the window. In the world of mysticism, anything that involves supernatural power is filled with danger. You can't be too careless. I had tried to use the mirror to do a divination, but I ended up garnering the attention of an unknown existence. After an intense struggle, I finally resolved the problem and prevented the danger from spreading across the street. The rat spoke fluently without any stammering or hesitation, as though being struck by lightning was something trivial. "Is that so? Why didn't you warn me of such matters in the past?" Hazel couldn't help but frown, as she could smell the mixed smell of charred fur and disintegrated fat. Without waiting for her reply, the rat turned to face the balcony and said to her with its back towards her, "My physical condition has deteriorated as a result. I'm no longer suited to staying here, or else I might be discovered by the Church of Evernite. Yes, find an opportunity to send me to your manor in the countryside." Looking at the rat's charred fur, and smelling the fragrance of roasted meat, Hazel fell silent for a few seconds. Suppressing her doubt, she nodded and said, "All right. 160 Bockland Street." Sitting in the reclining chair, Klein saw the full-body mirror ripple with aqueous light again as silver light arose. The silver words formed into a sentence: "Great Master, your puny servant, Rhodes, has followed your instructions to warn that demigod from the marauder pathway. I have also given her a tiny punishment." Just as Klein was ruminating over the pronoun Rhodes had used, light from the mirror's surface turned clear as it presented a scene. A silver bolt of lightning smote down, causing the grey rat to collapse while convulsing. "This is way too weak." Klein suddenly understood why this demigod's condition was weaker than he expected. "Are you satisfied with the way I handled it?" The silver lines quickly warped into a question. "Not bad." Klein nodded. Considering the demigod's condition, he paused for a second and probingly asked, "Why didn't you directly kill her?" Rhodes's mirror outlined silver words: "If one can't be certain in killing a demigod target, it's best not to force them into a corner. Once they aren't repressed, they will completely let themselves go. That would result in them mutating into an incomplete and irrational mythical creature. Most of the time, to have a problematic condition and to having trouble fully expressing their powers is because they are resisting their inclination of losing control. I am not here in my actual form, so all I can do is deal a small punishment." When the final line appeared, the full-body mirror's aqueous light shimmered. Klein suddenly had the feeling that a creature was looking at him with widened, watery eyes. He didn't respond towards that and instead nodded. "That's it for today. I'll summon you again if there's anything else." "All right, Master Tilda." The mirror immediately produced a hand-waving emoticon. After cleaning up the room, Klein finished his afternoon nap and left the master bedroom. Before long, the white-gloved Walter came to the third floor and entered the half-opened room with the balcony. He said to his employer, "Sir, the church has sent a letter. They've invited you to be a director in the board of directors for the Loan Charity Bursary Foundation. You can choose to directly take up a post there to receive a sizable salary. Or you can choose to take on a symbolic role. You will only participate in the discussion and vote when handling major matters. The church sure is efficient. It has already set up the framework." Klein thought and felt that since he had already donated more than £10,000, there was no need for him to claim a salary. It was better to not expect anything in return as he deliberated. "I'll take on a symbolic role. However, I wish to participate in some of the actual operations of the foundation in the future. I wish to contribute further to spread aid to help more people." "I will inform the church of your thoughts," Walter seriously replied. "If you have nothing else, it's best you head over on Wednesday morning to witness the official establishment of the foundation." Dwayne raised his porcelain cup and drank a mouthful of black tea. "Okay. Ellipsis. On the Golden Dream, Danitz sat in front of the deck, worriedly looking at the azure blue sea that was churning with waves. After being urged once by Gairman Sparrow, he felt that he couldn't delay any further. Otherwise, he might become a bounty at any time. I don't want to become a pile of cash while I'm sleeping. So what if I'm suspected? Danitz gritted his teeth and mustered his courage. He passed through the cabin door and headed straight for the captain's cabin. Being unable to find Anderson Hood in a short span of time, he could only ask Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards. After reaching his destination, Danitz took 3 deep breaths and raised his right hand, prepared to knock on the door. At this moment, Vice Admiral Iceberg's voice sounded from inside. "Please come in." Quote ellipsis quote. Danitz's right hand paused in midair as he forced a smile and entered. He saw that his captain was sitting behind a desk, holding a dark red fountain pen. He had no idea what she was writing. "Captain, I have something I'd like to consult you about." Danitz came over and bent his back slightly as he said with a smile. Edwina put down her fountain pen and pulled at her sleeves that were laced with flowers. She glanced at Danitz and said, "You wish to ask about West Balham?" "Ah." Danitz's expression froze. "The captain already knows. It must be those B Street RDs and doggish tea-like barrel and iron skin. They told Captain about it. I know that no secret can be kept on this ship. And it's even more so for Captain." After cursing inwardly, Danitz forced a smile again. "Yes, as you know, I'm very interested in history and geography." Edwina's limpid eyes moved slightly as she looked out the window. "This is international politics." Without waiting for the stiff Danitz to find another excuse, she continued on. "In West Balham, there are cities managed by the Loanese, valleys belonging to Intis, native generals who are supported by Loan, and tribes who follow Intis orders. There are also powerful independent states who rely on the requirement that both nations are balanced. They are secretly connected to the different factions of the Numinous Episcopate and are in a rivalry with those who claim to be the descendants of Death. In addition, the Rose School of Thought and Fezak Empire have a deep influence on West Balham. On the surface, none of the factions belong to them, but in fact, many of the generals and tribal chiefs have submitted to them. Among them." Danitz listened in surprise before he lowered his hand suddenly with a dry chuckle. "Captain, I need to take notes. Or else there's no way to memorize this." Edwina, who had been interrupted, wasn't mad. She pointed at the fountain pen and paper on the table. "That's a good habit. I believe Gairman Sparrow doesn't wish to receive erroneous information." "Ah." Danitz was stunned once again. "West Balham Shore is chaotic. It's difficult to even tell which backing faction that a medium-sized warlord belongs to, or who he's supported by. The Rose School of Thought has a very strong influence there. That means a sharp rise in risk for me." Klein had quickly scanned through Danitz's letter after receiving it from Miss Messenger Reinette Tinnecker. It made him believe that he shouldn't head to West Balham alone unless Mr. Azek accompanied him. Watching Miss Messenger leave, Klein glanced at the letter in his hand and considered the problem of West Balham again. He believed that he needed to make preparations in case that Mr. Azek wouldn't reply to him in the next month. That also meant that when July came, he might very well have to head to West Balham with a few military personnel, without the Death Consul's protection. If that happened, the shadow of the Rose School of Thought would ultimately hang over him. 2 choices. If I confirm that it's extremely dangerous, I'll directly abandon my identity as Dwayne Dantes. On the contrary, I should seriously consider a customer list. I will not have myself involved in any faction that's suspected to have ties with the Rose School of Thought. I might as well set a target first to make any unexpected developments be controllable." The information provided by Danitz likely comes from Vice Admiral Iceberg. The 2 native generals mentioned seem rather special. The other factions, regardless of the reason, will have a note of their ties with Loan, Intis, Fezak, and Fenapota, or the various inclinations of internal factions that form a counterbalance. Only, for them, there is no mention of foreign countries other than the point about receiving support from the Numinous Episcopate. Klein read the content from beginning to end as he vaguely figured something out. He had his initial suspicions that the 2 native generals were related to the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. The reason why Edwina didn't make any note was to deliberately point out the uniqueness, telling Gairman Sparrow that they were targets to cooperate with. This way, she didn't need to worry that there would be a leak from Danitz, as there was no information to leak other than a hint. May Sanchez, Katamia. The former receives the support from the royal faction of the Numinous Episcopate. The latter secretly claims to be a descendant of Death. Hey, even if it's real, who knows how many generations separated he is? If he were to meet Mr. Azek, how should he refer to him? Klein chuckled and shook his wrist, burning up the letter. Following that, he began enjoying an exquisite afternoon tea in the half-opened room with the balcony until Walter entered and whispered, "Sir, the police are here again. It's regarding Quiron's suicide." The matter's clues superficially pointed to Dwayne Dantes, so even though Baron Cindras had handled the matters, the police would visit him from time to time. Otherwise, the reporters would claim that it was a dereliction of duty by the police. As for the assault on Member of Parliament Macht, as Dwayne Dantes was only a relatively important eyewitness, they didn't disturb him further after taking his statement. Invite him to the activity room on the second floor with the garden. Klein placed the butter sponge cake he had taken a few bites from onto the plate and drank a mouthful of tea. As the master, he didn't need to worry that his food would go to waste. This was because the leftovers would be given to the servants. If he were to eat them clean all the time, or request them to prepare the perfect proportions, then his reputation as a stingy master would spread across the servants on the street before reaching the ears of the ladies and gentlemen. Walter replied with an unperturbed expression, "They wish for you to head to the police station. Today is the day the Quiron family will be identifying the suspect in a police lineup. They say that they are very sorry, but this is a necessary process that cannot be skipped." Klein slowly got up as he said, "Understandable. Richardson, get me my coat, hat, and cane." Since he was already no longer involved in the matter, he was rather willing to figure out what Quiron and his family had encountered from a bystander's perspective, and also how the matter had been directed towards Baron Cindras. Inside a spacious room in the police station at Northborough, Klein stood behind a glass wall and saw Quiron's family. It was an elderly man and woman, a woman in her late 30s, a teenager who was around the age of 15, and a girl who wasn't older than 10. The gaze swept the suspects behind the glass wall before landing on Dwayne Dantes at the same moment. "It's him! It's him!" the teenager yelled as his eyes turned red. He clenched his hands into a fist in an attempt to rush towards the glass wall. "It's him, officer! It's him!" The lady in her late 30s suddenly wept as she looked at Dwayne Dantes with eyes filled with hatred and animosity. The little girl who was holding her hand wailed, "Daddy! Return Daddy to me!" The two elders were wiping their tears. One of them was trying hard to keep calm, while the other was nearly fainting from her sobbing. The sorrowful mood instantly spread out. However, Klein had never even met them before today. Implanted memories. He frowned slightly. As he sighed, he began wondering what the Quiron family had encountered. Meanwhile, in the mortuary beneath the station, Daly Simone held a pencil and began sketching as her body shook slightly. As she was here to help at the police station, with the possibility of her encountering reporters when entering or exiting, she didn't wear her usual spirit medium robes. She changed into a female black and white police uniform set. She had a blouse and skirt on with matching leather boots. At this moment, her palm was moving uncontrollably, and soon, there was a desk, oriel window, ink bottle, revolver, and other items appearing on the piece of paper. On the oriel window, there was a figure reflected there. This figure's hair was neatly combed back, a mix of silver and raven black. The wrinkled figure had a broad forehead and high cheekbones. He was none other than Baron Cindras. "Pa." The pencil in Daly's hand dropped onto the piece of paper. She then looked up and said to Leonard, who offered to help, and the two police inspectors who were in charge of the liaison, in the second that Quiron committed suicide, he struggled deeply in his heart. That is to say that his suicide is a result of cueing and guidance. This isn't a simple psychological problem. It must have involved beyond our powers at a rather high level. And this contradictory struggle resulted in his emotions breaking down, suffering an explosion from his spirituality. Before his death, he would restore the truth to a certain degree. This is the scene that's fixed in his eyes. The high-ranking inspector beside her furrowed his brows. "Ma'am Simone, are you implying that the last person Quiron saw is the real murderer? Baron Cindras is actually the real murderer?" Leonard Mitchell immediately scoffed. "What you see might not be equivalent to the truth. You might not understand it if I call it an illusion, but if I'm a murderer, I can find a person that looks like Baron Cindras so as to make him appear inside the room before Quiron committed suicide." The two inspectors were very pleased with the explanation as they heaved a sigh of relief. "We've already arranged for Quiron's family to pay a visit. I'll have to trouble the two of you to obtain more clues that point towards the truth with non-intrusive means." "All right." Daly rubbed the corner of her eyes. "I'll use the washroom first." She hadn't put on her strange eyeshadow or blush. Apart from her skin appearing rather pale, she didn't have that uncanny look to her. Furthermore, she seemed younger, looking more like a woman in her 20s than 30s. Her eyes were bright, and she had beautiful facial features. Believing that they were in for plenty of work, Leonard Mitchell also left the mortuary and walked towards the washroom above them. Just as they finished climbing the staircase and turned a bend, they suddenly saw a gentleman with white sideburns appear on the other end of the corridor. He was walking out of the police station with his valet. This gentleman was mature and elegant, with eyes that were like a lake under the moon. He was none other than Duane Dantès. Daily Simone's mind went adrift for a moment as she turned her head in thought. She looked at Leonard Mitchell and discovered this black-haired, green-eyed poet was looking at Duane Dantès. "Why did you suddenly file for permission to help me? That member of the Numinous Episcopate will soon be found. You have no lack of tasks to do." Daly didn't give Leonard a chance to find an excuse. After pausing for a second, she directly asked, "You believe that gentleman from before is problematic?" Leonard retracted his gaze and fell silent for 2 seconds. Duane Dantès has met His Grace before. He deliberately didn't provide any sort of confirmation or denial, as though the question she had should be posed to St. Anthony. In between the lines, he was saying that His Grace didn't mention if there was any problem with Duane Dantès. Whether it was a lack of any detection or simply because he didn't say, that was up in the air. Daly nodded gently as she turned her gaze towards the washroom. On Wednesday morning, Audrey Hall, who had received an invitation, rode on a carriage to arrive at the St. Samuel Cathedral on Phelps Street. The Loan Charity Bursary Foundation, which was about to be established, was situated on 22 Phelps Street. The building belonged to the Church of Evernite, so there was no need to pay any rent. Before getting off the carriage, Audrey held the invitation and looked out at the scenery. She was filled with anticipation for the future. She was to become a director and would work on raising funds and with external liaisons. After entering 22 Phelps Street, Audrey instantly saw Duane Dantès walk out from the side corridor. This good-looking and gentlemanly gentleman was wearing a black formal suit and holding a gold-inlaid cane. He was communicating with the foundation's staff beside him. As though sensing Audrey's gaze, Duane Dantès naturally turned his head and looked at the door. Then, his eyes lit up in amazement like he had seen a treasure. Following that, he smiled and gently nodded as a greeting. Audrey returned with a smile and nod that wasn't a breach of etiquette in any way. She then followed the Loan Charity Bursary Foundation staff that came to escort her and walked up to the second floor. During this process, although she didn't look in any other direction, but be it the talent of a woman or her instincts as a spectator, they told her that Duane Dantès' gaze kept following her figure in secret until the wall beside the staircase blocked his view. Impeccable acting. He perfectly played out the reaction of what a gentleman who has zero resistance against beauties but remains sufficiently reserved and cultured would do when meeting me for the second time. It's as though we have only met once at the charity party the last time. It's exactly as I imagined. He was even able to light up his eyes. This is a technique that's part of his beyond a pathway, or is it an ability that he possesses to begin with? I have to say that Gairman Sparrow, I think it's better to use Mr. Gairman Sparrow is a professional, no, an excellent actor. Furthermore, he doesn't act in an exaggerated manner like those play actors. Audrey complimented in thought before seeing a few reporters waiting to interview her about the establishment of the Loan Charity Bursary Foundation on the second floor. She wasn't a noble lady who enjoyed having her photo plastered on the papers. As she exchanged a few words with her valet that had accompanied her to inform the reporters that pictures were forbidden by Earl Hall's authority, she went into the VIP lounge with her lady's maid, Annie. Earl Hall was friends with the owners of a few publishing houses and had made the corresponding investments to acquire quite a bit of their shares. If Audrey so wished, she could exchange some of the estate she received in order to create a sizable publishing house. In the VIP lounge, Audrey, who didn't find it appropriate to bring her dog, greeted the children of the rich and aristocracy, as well as the church's clergymen. She habitually found a seat where she could see everyone, and she waited until the opening ceremony began and for the first board of directors meeting to begin. She surveyed the area and said to the female staff that was in charge of escorting her, "Loveser, this is my first time joining in the actual operations of a charity organization. I wish to know what we should do." The lady named Loveser was still in her 20s. She also had blonde hair with somewhat rough skin and tan freckles. However, her smile was brilliant, making her rather affectionate. Upon hearing Audrey's question, Loveser introduced without holding anything back, the current plan is to not be too eager in widening the scale. We will start mainly with Backland and reach deep into the public primary schools, weekday schools, and night schools, promoting the bursary to all the students and let those in need to apply to us. After the application, we will organize a committee to do the exact audit. This will not only require us to make some verifications with the government, but we would also walk across the grounds to understand the candidate's actual situation. Once the examination is over, we will disperse the bursary and help the poor who yearn for knowledge to change their fates. Just as Loveser said that, a male voice filled with magnetism interjected, I have 2 suggestions. The first suggestion is that staff are to be gathered today to head to the different weekday schools, night schools, and public primary schools to promote the bursary. June is the examination period, and it's a critical period for them to enter institutes of higher learning. If we aren't efficient enough, there will be many students from poor families that will give up taking the examination because of the lack of funds. Even if they later learn of the existence of the Bursary Foundation, they won't be able to withstand the loss of wasting a year. As such, they will lose the chance at changing their fate. What we are doing might seem simple, but it completely affects each and every child's life. Therefore, we need to begin quickly and not waste any time. The person who was speaking was none other than Dwayne Dantes, who had just entered the lounge. He expressed his thoughts with a warm but serious expression. All right, June is the examination period. Be it entering grammar school or the preparations to enter university, as well as the various technical schools to gain experience in their profession, this is a critical period. Once they give up the entry examinations this time, they will have to wait till next June. I actually forgot this. Ma'am Loveser and the foundation staff seems to have missed this problem. Mr. Dwayne Dantes actually noticed such a detail and had considered those children who were so close to giving up the dreams. He's actually a person with a gentle heart. Audrey suddenly felt that she had a new take on Dwayne Dantes, on Gairman Sparrow. This was what a spectator had just obtained. A cold assassin, adventurer on the surface but has a warm heart deep down. Unfortunately, I've only been able to obtain descriptions regarding Gairman Sparrow's crazy side. I'm unable to find any concrete proof. Audrey blinked as she carefully listened to Dwayne Dantes' suggestions. Second suggestion. In regards to the bursaries that are to be disbursed, it's best if it's put in the corresponding bank account. When school fees need to be paid, they can bring the documents to us to apply for a withdrawal. For relatively cheaper board and lodging, things don't have to be that troublesome. They can obtain a fixed sum of money every month or week. This is to prevent the applicant's parents and siblings from spending the money. To a poor family, this is an irresistible temptation. Similarly, an account corresponds to one person. No matter who is withdrawing it, the person has to be present. This can effectively prevent people from suffering from the trial of greed. Having said that, Klein pressed his palm to his chest and said to Audrey and Loveser, sorry, pardon me for barging into your conversation. Audrey smiled and said, Mr. Dantes, your suggestions are excellent. You have opened my eyes to matters that I never considered before. The only problem is that what you say to us is meaningless. I'm only listening to Ma'am Loveser's introduction. Loveser smiled and said, yes, you should mention all of these at the first board of directors meeting. Don't you see me deliberately coming over to convince Miss Audrey first? With Justice's part in this, I can ensure that there will be no objections from the board of directors. Otherwise, it might easily be tabled or altered by someone using some excuse such as lacking manpower. Klein made an enlightened and regretful expression as he rubbed his palms slightly. Look at me, being all anxious about these matters and forgetting my place. Ha ha ha. Sometimes, I just wish that things will be made into reality once I'm given the chance. Mr. Dwayne Dantes' acting is a little exaggerated. He should know that he can't fool me. Oh, he's doing it deliberately to communicate with me ahead of time without leaving behind any traces. He wants me to support him. Audrey instantly read his thoughts as her smile turned clearer. Although she hadn't communicated with the world ahead of time, she believed that she would support this tarot club member of hers. However, being able to exchange some ideas ahead of time left her rather happy. This was because she felt that he was treating her as an equal. After forgiving Dwayne Dantes' recklessness and watching the man walk to the table with beverages and pastries in the lounge, Audrey looked away and said to Loveser, what I'm responsible for is to raise funds at different occasions, and to communicate with the government and parliament. That should be a simple matter for you, Loveser answered frankly. This was also why the church's charity department didn't object to Audrey Hall's participation. In fact, they were very supportive of it. Audrey nodded in thought and said, "If I have the time to spare, can I join you in visiting the different schools for the promotions, as well as the examination of the candidates?" Loveser was originally unwilling to agree, worried that the environment wasn't suitable for Miss Audrey. But when she saw her clear green eyes and took in her request that she couldn't resist, her heart softened. She felt that such kindness shouldn't be stopped. It wasn't to be isolated from the reality of the lower class. If Miss Audrey sees true misery and ugliness and is still willing to help the pitiful people, she will definitely be able to be of greater use. It will prevent the higher-ups from always formulating unrealistic measures. Loveser quickly found a convincing reason as she sighed and smiled. "No problem. However, you won't be able to wear such a dress or wear any jewelry." "What do I do with lie?" "Turn it into a bracelet and hide it under my sleeves." Audrey thought as she replied with a smile, "All right." Ellipsis. With Miss Audrey Hall's support, the Loan Charity Bursary Foundation's first board of directors meeting ended perfectly after its establishment. Klein returned to 160 Bockland Street in a good mood. Following his usual habits, he entered his master bedroom at around 2 to have an afternoon nap. In his hazy dream, Klein suddenly jolted awake and sensed something. Someone was attempting to infiltrate his dream. "Who is it now? I'm even getting disturbed in my afternoon naps." As Klein mumbled, he made the dream transform into the half-open room with the balcony. Then, he saw the black-haired, green-eyed Leonard with his unkempt clothes somersault through the window. Does this fellow not know how to use the main door? Why is he suddenly here? I should remember to get his contact method. Klein sat in his reclining chair, feeling peeved and amused. He looked at the poet with a leisurely expression and said, "This is an impolite way of visiting me." When Leonard heard that, he bowed in a manner that lacked standards. "Mr. Dantes, I have something I would like to consult you on." "Consult? That's a nice attitude. Also, it doesn't seem to be anything major." Klein secretly tsked as he said, "What's the matter?" Leonard grabbed a seat and deliberated before asking, "You were embroiled in Quiron's suicide. Who do you think the real murderer is?" "If I wanted to know, I would have thrown out Frank's mushrooms. However, I can't say that I've no idea at all. That just lowers the impression he has on me." Klein was very accustomed to such situations, so he expertly laughed and, instead of answering, asked, "How were your investigations?" Leonard Mitchell clasped his hands together and leaned in slightly. "We have restored the scene Quiron saw before his death. This didn't directly show the murderer, but the glass on the oriel window happened to reflect Baron Syndras's figure." After a pause, Leonard added, "This is too simple and unconvincing. A powerful banker and noble at Baron Syndras's level wouldn't need to personally take action or be present to watch if he wants someone dead, unless he has some special fetishes. And as you know, there are many ways to replicate such scenes, be it via an illusion or disguise." When he mentioned disguise, he looked up slightly and glanced at Dwayne Dantes. It was as though he was implying that the latter's present appearance was unlikely his true appearance, just like Gairman Sparrow and Sherlock Moriarty. What a simple and direct way of framing someone. It's really suspect if the murderer behind the scenes really wants to frame Baron Syndras. I should process everything from the beginning. First, assuming that I, in other words, Dwayne Dantes, act like an ordinary person. Anyway, I won't mention the conclusion and only raise questions to guide his train of thought. If the final answer isn't right, that must be because my dear poet misinterpreted it and was unable to figure out what I was getting at. Klein smiled as he raised his porcelain cup and took a sip of black tea. Let's not consider this problem first. If the person who wasn't embroiled in this matter wasn't me, how would the case have developed? Leonard raised his clasped hands slightly as he tapped his index finger. As a suspect, Dwayne Dantes would be remanded at the police station, but his butler, servants, neighbors, and friends will be able to testify that he has never made contact with Quiron's family. Hence, the testimonies from both sides will contradict strongly. The police will be unable to handle it and request the Nighthawks to intervene. Using mediumship means, we will see the scene Quiron had before committing suicide, thus, obtaining Baron Syndras's figure. As he spoke, Leonard suddenly fell silent. After a few minutes, he continued speaking under Dwayne Dantes's smiling gaze. Regardless of the unconvincing, odd, and simplistic nature of the clue involving Baron Syndras, we will follow protocol and make contact with him and begin the relevant investigations. And this will lead to certain problems related to him being noticed by us. Baron Syndras is involved in matters involving the Beyonder domain, so he can't stand up to further scrutiny from the Nighthawks. The more Leonard spoke, the more certain he became. It was as though he had figured out the mastermind's line of thought. He, or they, might not care if their trap is seen through. As long as they get the Nighthawks to do a routine investigation on him, the goal will be achieved. This is because Baron Syndras hides a rather serious and easily discoverable problem. Yes, that's the same conclusion I have. This is actually closer to sounding the alarms by providing a tip-off, but it's more mild. It looks like a trap that will make the Nighthawks definitely investigate things while hiding their existence. Of course, I won't directly acknowledge your guess. Wouldn't it be awkward if I was actually wrong? Klein crossed his right leg over his left and laughed. Baron Syndras, who has been alerted, definitely won't show any problems now. Leonard slowly nodded and said, as though explaining to himself, this Baron's experiences are rather legendary. He has been pushed to the brink of bankruptcy a few times, but he managed to turn the tide and ended up reaching a new height. Perhaps, in one of these instances, he had sold his soul to the devil, an evil god, or some other secret existence out of desperation. This story is quite reasonably crafted. Klein didn't comment on the accuracy of Leonard's guess before asking, on the other hand, how would the Nighthawks treat the real murderer that led to Quiron's suicide? Leonard temporarily put aside all his previous thoughts, and he began following the train of thought based on an ordinary development. The design trap is too crude. The cueing, guidance, and memory implants were done in an insufficiently concealed and mild manner. It's easy for people to discover problems. Therefore, it's unlikely to be done by mid or high sequence Beyonders from the spectator pathway. It looks more like it was done by a Beyonder from another pathway who relied on a mystical item to pose as a spectator. Before he finished his sentence, Leonard fell into silence again, his thoughts a mystery. Klein maintained his faint smile as he calmly looked at the poet. It was as though he had everything under control, but he wasn't going to say a thing. Everything depended on what Leonard figured out. This is very similar to what Old Man said from before. Is it really done by some mid or high sequence Beyonder from the spectator pathway? His seemingly crude and flawed setup was actually a precise consideration of everyone's reaction. Everyone's response at every step of the way was taken into consideration, with the only mistake stemming from Dwayne Dantes' experience and wisdom. Leonard felt that he had already figured out the truth as he got up and coughed gently. Thank you for your advice. Klein immediately chortled and said, I didn't say anything. Without waiting for Leonard's response, he said, your former colleague got me to ask you how he should inform you if he were to discover traces of Ins Sangwil. Leonard, who had planned on getting up to bid farewell, sat back down. Colored with a complicated expression, he said after more than 10 seconds of silence, pass the information in the form of a letter to 7 Pinster Street. This means that he won't be leaving Backland anytime soon. Or is it that no matter how far he goes to carry out missions, he will have the means to monitor 7 Pinster Street and read the letter remotely? It might be the latter assumption. A Marauder Pathways angel definitely has many magical secret techniques. Leonard can definitely use one of them. I can't ask, or else it will lower Dwayne Dantes' level and destroy my setting. Klein wore an unperturbed expression as he said with a smile, I'll inform him. Leonard didn't immediately leave as he opened his mouth, paused, and asked, if I wish to contact him, how should I do it? His green eyes were deep as they spoke volumes when he asked. Klein was already prepared, so he said with a smile, the spirit that wanders about the unfounded, the friendly creature that can be subordinated, the messenger that belongs to Gehrman Sparrow. You can ask Pallas about the exact ritual if you aren't too sure. Leonard knew that Gehrman Sparrow was Sherlock Moriarty, who was also Klein Moretti. He nodded indiscernibly and stood up. Thank you for informing me. Please pardon me for my intrusion. With that said, he retreated to the door, opened it, and left the dream. Hey, you left just like that. As a nightmare, or as a former nightmare, shouldn't you consider how there might be problems with your memory? You remembered it just from hearing it once. You aren't putting enough weight on this matter. Klein couldn't help but lampoon when he saw Leonard's figure disappear. He shook his head in exasperation, ended his afternoon nap, and began busying himself over the matter regarding West Balham. On the Golden Dream, Danitz, who had finally finished his mission, drank some iced light beer because of the recent hot weather. If it wasn't because the creation of ice needed Beyonder powers, and that there wasn't much to go around, he felt that he could finish half a bucket of ice in one go. That's what I call life. Danitz guzzled the remaining liquid in his cup. At this moment, he saw greyish-white fog appear before him as Gairman Sparrow's voice began echoing in his ears. Please inform Danitz that he is to immediately head to West Balam. Figure out the situation of the areas under the control of the two native generals, May Sanchez and Katamia. He should take special note of any signs of Rose School of Thought activity. Head to West Balam. With a cup in hand, Danitz stammered Gairman Sparrow's request repeatedly. He had once headed there with the Golden Dream crew to seek out treasure. He had also obtained rather detailed intel from his captain, therefore, he knew how chaotic and dangerous West Balam was. Furthermore, I have to go alone. Danitz uttered a sound as he found his future bleak. Primitive forests with all kinds of hidden and terrifying creatures, native tribes who believed in death and had all sorts of peculiarities, paths filled with bandits and rebel armies, villages with wraiths and shadows haunting him, and cities that had gunfights or even beyond a battles surfaced in his mind. No, I have to say no to Gairman Sparrow. Say no. He should at least send me a helper. Ordinary people can survive in West Balam and become rich, having their own manners. This means that it's not as horrifying as I imagine it to be. I'm just frightening myself. Besides, Gairman Sparrow just requested me to figure out the situation, not to contact anyone. Danitz quickly forced a smile and requested Mr. Fool to inform Gairman Sparrow that he would immediately take action. Then, following Gairman Sparrow's instructions, he set up a bestowment ritual to pray to Mr. Fool. When the ritual came to an end, he saw an illusory door open. A dark golden sunbird-shaped brooch flew out, landing on the altar. Sun brooch. In the southern continent, in a kingdom once ruled by death, the sun pathway was one of the most effective beyond pathways. Directly giving me such a precious item. It's not bad working for Gairman Sparrow. However, he said something about it being borrowed. Danitz picked up the brooch and felt his surroundings turn hot and humid. After handing out a mission to Danitz, Klein was just about to open the door to instruct Richardson to get him a cup of iced water when he felt his spiritual perception trigger. Immediately, he activated his spirit vision and saw Reinette Tinnicker walk out of the void. She held the four blonde, red-eyed heads in her hand, with one of them having a letter in its mouth. Who's it from? Leonard. Klein reached out his right hand in suspicion. 7 Pinster Street. Leonard Mitchell came to his desk and unfolded a piece of paper. He then picked up a fountain pen and lowered his wrist in preparation to write. However, just as he dipped a dark blue spot onto the paper, his fountain pen paused. He attempted to move his wrist in order to write a few times, but all his attempts ended up stopping due to hesitation. He raised his wrist, lowered the fountain pen, and repeated this action again and again. Finally, he froze his wrist in midair. Leonard threw down his fountain pen, crumpled the piece of paper, and accurately threw it into the trash can. At 160 Bockland Street, Klein received a thin letter from one of Miss Messenger Reinette Tinnicker's heads. He felt the weight in his hands, and only when his spiritual intuition didn't send him any warnings did he tear it open and retrieve the letter inside. There was only one page, and on it were 2 lines of text written in neat, beautiful handwriting. I have something that will require your help. Let's discuss it in detail, face to face. Sharon, so it's Miss Sharon. Klein had his questions answered as he took out a gold coin and did a simple divination in front of Reinette Tinnicker. Then, he took out another piece of paper and wrote one word, tonight. After he folded the letter, he asked Miss Messenger as he handed it to her, can you still locate her? If it wasn't possible, he planned on giving her Sharon's mailing address. Hillston Borough, 126 Guard Street, Mayum. Yes, one of Reinette Tinnicker's blonde, red-eyed heads gave an answer. The head then opened its mouth and bit down on the letter. After Miss Messenger vanished from the room, Klein immediately held a ritual, planning to bring Creeping Hunger back to the real world from above the grey fog. He then planned on traveling to the various archipelagos in search of a lucky pirate. Creeping Hunger hadn't been sealed yet, so it still required feeding once a day. All Klein could do was barely use it, feeding it whenever he needed to use it. He would then throw it back above the grey fog when the next feeding time was at hand. He wasn't planning on making up for the difference. If Creeping Hunger dares to make a fuss about it, I'll feed it mushrooms. After ending the ritual and clearing up the scene, Klein wore the thin human-skinned glove, turning his body translucent until he vanished from his spot. He had his dinner, and after waiting for Creeping Hunger to finish its howling above the grey fog, Klein went to retrieve it by using the excuse of having an upset stomach to enter the bathroom. He then used this opportunity to teleport to the area outside the Bravehearts bar in the Backland Bridge area. During this process, he had already changed his appearance, turning into the black-haired, mustached, and bespectacled detective, Sherlock Moriarty. Bending his back and rolling up his pant legs, Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh. He lowered his hat and nudged open the heavy wooden door to step into the bar. After asking the bartender, he held a cup of Southville beer and went to billiard room 3, where he knocked on the locked door. Knock, knock, knock. Amidst the rhythmic knock, the door creaked open a tiny gap. The red-eyed Ian peeped his head out before breaking out into a smile. "Sir, please come on in." As the weather was turning warm, he no longer wore his old coat. Instead, he wore a simple linen shirt. Klein nodded with a smile and quickly entered the billiard room, where he took in the surroundings almost instantly. Marich, with his hair a little messy, was wearing a white shirt, black vest, and black pants. He was holding onto a cue stick and had his back bent to play billiards. Perhaps having a deep impression of causing chaos for Sherlock Moriarty, he didn't summon his zombies to play cards with him. "Long time no see," Klein greeted first. Meanwhile, Sharon, with her small black bonnet and black, regal gown, appeared beside the billiard table, sitting on a high stool. "Good evening, ma'am." Klein moved his gaze over and bowed with a smile. Sharon seemed to float up as she stood up before raising the hem of her skirt to do a slight bow as a polite response. As for Marich, he lowered his cue stick and said in a gruff voice, "From the looks of it, you're still in Backland." His face was as pale as ever, but the evil look in his brown eyes had lessened significantly. It seemed to be evidence of the effective temperance he had in recent times. It was apparent that his acquisition of the Scarlet Lunar Corona prevented him from almost breaking down on every full moon, so much so that he didn't need to frequently switch to new types of sedatives. Klein didn't directly answer Marich. Instead, he walked to the billiard table and put down his beer. Smiling, he said, "I'm very sorry. I was planning to sell a Wraith Beyonder characteristic to you, but unfortunately it was lost." Sharon's blue eyes didn't move, nor did she probe for a reason. All she asked was a simple, "Are you all right?" She knew that the Wraith Beyonder characteristic Sherlock Moriarty mentioned belonged to Admiral of Blood Sonor. And he was also Sherlock Moriarty's marionette. By losing the Wraith Beyonder characteristic, it also meant the loss or destruction of his marionette. This was a significant loss for such a Beyonder. "I'm still all right. At least I didn't suffer any harm," Klein said with a sighing smile. "No wonder I didn't see Sonor this time." Marich muttered in enlightenment. Marich and Miss Sharon don't seem too bothered about the lack of that Wraith Beyonder characteristic. They have other means or methods to acquire one. Klein sharply grasped this point and switched to asking, "Is there something this time?" Marich immediately glanced at Ian. The staid teenager didn't ask further as he quickly left the billiard room and closed the door. Sharon's doll-like face didn't show any emotion as she allowed Marich to speak. "Tomorrow, there will be a ship from the southern continent arriving in Pritz Harbor. It is intimately tied to the Loan Army. This ship carries with it treasure and relics plundered from the Star Highlands, Paz Valley, and Hargati Plains. Among them is a mummy. It's the 19th king of the ancient Hargati Plains, Tutanses II. The southern continent's original language didn't stem from ancient Phasation. It had its own structure. In the ancient Highlander language, king also has the special term, Kadiev. It was translated by Emperor Roselle as Pharaoh. It's a mystery what he was thinking. Also, mummy was named by him too. In short, the meaning of Pharaoh is the son of God, king of humans. Tutanses II was once a high-sequence Beyonder. However, after his death, the corresponding characteristic was taken away, leaving only his corpse behind to be made into a mummy. To other Beyonders, this is a material filled with spirituality, an excellent choice for creating a zombie. But to us, it has another meaning, a very important meaning. Our goal this time is to obtain that Tutanses II mummy. Another meaning, the corpse of a high-sequence Beyonder without any Beyonder characteristic. Apart from using it as a material, there's another meaning to it. Klein's heart stirred as he suddenly thought of Ma'am Hermit's request to purchase a drop of mythical creature blood. Could it be the ritual requirement to go from sequence 5 Wraith to sequence 4 Puppet? Miss Sharon already has the formula and has digested the Wraith potion. From the way she acts, she's practically acting as a Wraith all the time. Who knows, she might have digested it a long time ago. However, when we were in the underground ruin talking to the evil spirit, it was evident that she didn't possess the puppet potion formula. Yes, everyone has their own circles. It's not strange for her to be able to obtain it. Klein swept his gaze at Sharon while in thought, but he failed to discover any obvious changes from before. She was still more like a doll than a living person. However, she didn't show any signs of being even darker and creepier. Sharon silently sat there and watched Sherlock Moriarty and Marich intently, listening into their conversation. If it's just a high-sequence mummy without a Beyonder characteristic, the level of protection can't be too high. Just the two of you shouldn't find it difficult to snatch it away. Klein raised a suspicion. From his point of view, a Sequence 5 Beyonder could be considered quite a powerhouse. Unless the ship had a demigod escorting it, it was very difficult for Beyonders at the same level to put up any effective resistance if her target was solely a mummy. After all, there were too many items the Beyonder guards had to look out for. Furthermore, they might be scattered in different cabins due to the different means of storage. This time, it was Sharon's turn to provide the explanation. She used her succinct manner of speech as usual. We're worried that it's a trap the Rose School of Thought is using to target us. If there's nothing, £1,000. If there's something, we will be in charge of drawing attention while you take away the mummy. Depending on the level of danger, it will range from £5,000 to £10,000. I see. Klein didn't immediately reply as he thought and asked, do you know of spirit world plunderers? A wraith was also a type of Beyonder who could effectively move through the spirit world. Sharon nodded slightly and said, I can use the cash and the relevant information about spirit world plunderers as payment. Klein tersely acknowledged. I'll consider it. I'll write to you before midnight. As an excellent seer, he would head above the grey fog to confirm the level of danger regardless of what it was. However, he could confirm that this was definitely not a trap targeted at him since he had no need for a mummy. All right, Sharon replied with a deadpan expression. Klein didn't immediately bid them farewell as he walked to the door and informed Ian to enter. He then asked, are there any news worth taking note of recently? Ian thought for a moment and mentioned pieces of information that were relatively important. Someone is trying to find out about the organization that believes in the Fool. Klein was somewhat surprised as he asked with a smile, a young man with black hair and green eyes. He suspected that it was Leonard Mitchell. Ian shook his head. No, black hair and black eyes. Some mister from the Aurora Order. Klein considered for a moment before asking, can you draw who it is? Ian was taken aback before he said in a self-deprecating manner. You might never be able to recognize him if that's the case. At this moment, Sharon said, I can help you. All right. Ian first heaved a sigh of relief before following the instructions to prepare a rather simple ritual. Then, his body trembled as he drew a sketch while being possessed by a wraith. It was a young man with curly black hair, black eyes, a wide forehead, and a thin face while wearing a monocle. Amen. Blasphemer Amen. Amen. Klein's pupils constricted, and although he looked normal on the surface, he tensed up significantly with his heart churning with waves of alarm. Although he had kept using Amen to scare the grandpa in Leonard's body, as well as the Marauder Pathway demigod beside Hazel, he was only using the name. He never expected that this blasphemer, a king of angels, would arrive in Backland so quickly. He was even looking for the organization that believed in the Fool. In fact, although it's surprising, it's understandable. With Backland having an angel and demigod of the Marauder Pathway, it's only a matter of time before Amen arrives based on the law of Beyonder characteristics convergence. The only problem is that he has been searching for something in the forsaken land of the gods for so many years, so it's unlikely he would suddenly abandon his search. Besides, his mausoleum in the outskirts of Backland has been destroyed by the machinery Hivemind, making it difficult for him to come and go as he pleases. Therefore, this isn't his main body, but an avatar. An avatar that exists in the northern continent. An angel of the Marauder Pathway should be good at using worms of time to create avatars. Amen must be stronger than them. Klein's thoughts raced as fast as lightning as he gradually came to a certain conclusion. At times, he even suspected that the mythical creature of the Marauder Pathway was a bunch of worms of time that combined together via a certain method. As a Marauder Pathway's king of angels before the cataclysm, Amen definitely knows what the name, the Fool, means and can detect the corresponding aura. He might even wish to steal control over the grey fog. He came here for the Fool this time. This is really going to be a headache. After his initial shock, Klein gradually composed himself. What he was most afraid of now was that he would end up encountering Blasphemer Amen because of the law of Beyonder characteristics convergence. And Amen was clearly able to detect his uniqueness. When that happens, it might not even cause a stir before the so-called the Fool had to consider if he could be resurrected. After all, this was a king of angels, an existence just second to a true god. Furthermore, the Marauder pathway was always known for the deceit and concealment. Aemon wasn't necessarily afraid to take action, even in Backland. Perhaps stealing the fate of others was a strength of his. From the looks of it, temporarily leaving Backland to head for West Balam might not be a bad choice. Anyway, the biggest problem stems from myself. If I had already advanced and become a Bizarro sorcerer, I'll be able to hide the Grey Fog's aura. Even if I encounter Aemon, I won't have to be afraid of exposing anything. Klein drew a silent breath as he once again felt a sense of urgency. He needed to quickly push open the door to Sequence 4, change his existence, and become a demigod. For this, he needed to work harder, be it making another marionette, acting at a deeper level to speed up his digestion, or gathering the corresponding ingredients. Phew, Backland really is a terrifying place. If Ouroboros hasn't left, or if he has already returned, just the ones I know would number 5 angels, including 2 kings of angels. I haven't included the royal family and military who use Backland as their base. I haven't included the underground evil spirit whose whereabouts are unknown. A former king of angels that fused with the wills of 2 other angels. If the Rose School of Thought's abomination sewer comes in pursuit of Gehrman Sparrow, that would really be a bustle. This would be nothing compared to the demigod-level battle outside Biome City. Klein looked at the sketch drawn by Ian as he vaguely shook his head. Okay, got it. He shook his head. To Ian and Marriage, he had said so because he didn't know the monocled man, but in fact, he was expressing his exasperation. I'll have to leave. I'll reply to you before midnight. Klein took off his hat and bowed, slowly walking out of the billiard room. He then teleported back to 160 Bockland Street from a secluded alley outside the Bravehearts bar. Inside his master bedroom, the first thing he considered wasn't Miss Sharon's and Marriage's request, but on how he was to deal with the problems that Aemon brought with him. In such aspects, being rather experienced, he quickly came up with an idea. It was to find something for Aemon to do to draw his attention away. As for what that was, it was definitely something he found irresistible, something that he would definitely be interested in, for example, an angel from the Marauder pathway, Pallas Zoroast. Perhaps this was key to Aemon's ability to become a Sequence 0 true god. It would be something far more important than finding the organization that believed in the fool. Of course, Klein definitely wouldn't directly sell out Leonard's grandpa, because he had yet to show any ill intent to date. His thoughts were simple. It was to inform this matter to Pallas Zoroast that Aemon was already in Backland. He wanted to see the reaction of the angel who had survived since the 4th epoch, then, he would follow up based on the situation. If that grandpa is helpless against Aemon, who's likely only an avatar, he can only get Leonard to use the excuse of a mission to leave Backland to hide from Aemon. As for me, I'll have to bring forward my trip to West Balam. I'll just say that it has something important to do with my network. I'll secretly teleport back for the placenta blood when Snake of Fate will Orsepton is born. Klein arrived at a decision as he took out a piece of paper and wrote, Aemon has arrived. Folding the letter and putting it into an envelope, Klein took out the adventurer's harmonica and blew hard. When Reinette Tinnicker appeared, he took out a gold coin from his pocket and pressed it on the envelope. This was one of the 10 gold coins that he had gotten Richardson to exchange for him in the afternoon. It was to maintain his image of Dwayne Dantes to being equal to someone at the level of Pallas Zoroast. Even when Klein informed Leonard Mitchell of the method of contact, he didn't inform him that the payment of a gold coin was needed. This shows that face is something you buy with money. As Klein sighed, he said to Miss Messenger, who was wearing a dark, complicated dress. Send the letter to 7 Pinster Street. Oh, just throw it into the mailbox. There's no need to send it to the addressee. As he wasn't certain of Pallas Zoroast's true intentions and character, Klein wished to hide more of his trump cards in front of him. Therefore, before Leonard wrote to Klein Moretti, he had no plans on letting the poet see Miss Messenger. The blonde, red-eyed head in Reinette Tinniker's left hand was raised up as it sucked the letter and gold coin into its mouth. However, she didn't immediately disappear. Instead, she floated at her spot, looking at Klein silently with all 8 eyes. What's wrong? Klein was taken aback before coming up with a guess. He asked with an odd expression, you don't know where 7 Pinster Street is. Only then did he recall that a messenger's delivery of letters depended on their mysticism-based location. It was based on the person they contracted with and people they had formerly delivered letters to. Therefore, once the latter left a detectable range, the messenger would not be able to find them. Upon hearing Klein's question, two of Reinette Tinneker's heads nodded in unison, indicating that she didn't know. Klein immediately coughed lightly, pulled out the drawer, and took out a map of Backland. He then used a fountain pen to circle out Northborough. Following that, he circled Pinster Street. When you're here, you will see the unit number on the buildings. Klein folded the map and handed it over. The head in Reinette Tinneker's right hand immediately opened its mouth and bit down on the map. Then, her figure phased away and entered the spirit world. Upon seeing this, Klein heaved a sigh of relief. He turned and walked out of his master bedroom and headed for the half-open room with the balcony to read the papers and magazines. Late into the night, he took 4 steps counterclockwise before soaking into the bathtub and entering the mysterious space above the grey fog. Helping Sharon and Marich obtain the Tutankhamun II mummy is dangerous. Klein took off the topaz pendant on his left wrist and let it hang to perform a divination. This time, the spirit pendulum rotated clockwise with a weak amplitude and relatively slow frequency. This means that the danger isn't too great. Furthermore, even if it's a trap targeted at Miss Sharon and Marich, there's no need for the present me to be too afraid. Klein beckoned with his hand as he made a translucent miniature black crystal card fly to him. This was the Fate Siphon charm. Klein had used a Worm of Time to create a demigod-level high-level charm. Right on the heels of that, he summoned Creeping Hunger and the Sea God Scepter. Wearing the former, he picked up the latter and recorded Lightning Storm and Hurricane. The mutated and upgraded Creeping Hunger could use Mr. X's soul and characteristic to record 2 demigod-level Beyonder powers that didn't exceed Sequence 3. With this, Klein no longer needed to borrow Leymano's travels anymore. Furthermore, it was more convenient. After all, flipping a spellbook affected his use of Death Knell and the Fate Siphon charm, unless he grew another 2 hands. After making his preparations, Klein returned to the real world, pulled out a piece of paper and wrote simply, exact time, location, and plan. Ellipsis. At 1 a.m., Leonard, who had slept 2 hours, woke up energetically. He prepared to leave 7 Pinster Street and head for the St. Samuel Cathedral's basement. Just as he stepped out the door, he suddenly had his spiritual intuition trigger before he subconsciously cast his gaze to the side. A look of puzzlement flashed in his eyes as he walked over and opened the mailbox. During dinner, he had cleared the newspapers, bills, and letters inside. Typically, there wouldn't be any items in the mailbox until daybreak. After all, the mailmen would have clocked off work and returned home. However, at this moment, there was a thin letter waiting silently at the bottom of the mailbox. "Old man, you didn't inform me of a new letter," Leonard said softly as he picked up the letter. The slightly aged voice in his mind replied, "The person didn't enter." Leonard knew that old man's senses were limited to his body, hence, he didn't speak further. He tore open the envelope and took out the letter, flicking it flat. The letter was mostly empty with just one short line, "Eamon has arrived." Eamon has arrived. Leonard's pupils dilated immediately. At the same time, he heard the parasite in him gasp for the first time. Towards Eamon, Leonard didn't have a strong, direct impression of him. All he knew was that it was the most feared enemy of the parasite in his body. He was the culprit that left this mysterious and powerful old man injured to this day. Therefore, he quickly calmed down and asked with a suppressed voice, "What do we do now?" In his mind, the slightly aged voice sounded after 3 seconds. The one that came probably isn't Eamon's actual body but one of his avatars. He, indeed, Blasphemer Eamon is an angel, and probably a Sequence 1 angel. After all, Old Man is suspected to be a grounded angel. As Leonard absorbed the information to verify his theories, he listened to Pallas Zoroast continue, "If Eamon's actual body appears in Backland, it might very well cause a deity's descent." A deity's descent? How many years has it been since something like this happened? Since the 5th epoch, occurrences like these were legends that were recorded in the internal canon. They had never publicly happened before. Could this mean that, even among Sequence 1s, Eamon is one of the most powerful existences? It's no wonder he is called a blasphemer. In just a few words, Leonard came to realize how terrifying the angel named Eamon was. Standing in front of the mailbox, his thoughts wandered when he suddenly had an idea. He hurriedly suppressed his voice and said, "Since Eamon has such importance placed on him by the deities, shouldn't we try to find a way to inform the Church of the news of his appearance in Backland?" From Leonard's point of view, the Church of Evernight and Storm, which was born in an earlier epoch and existed through the entire 4th epoch, had rich experience in resisting angels. They were the best choice at dealing with Eamon. In his mind, Pallas Zoroast chortled. It's useless. It might even be something Aemon wishes to accomplish. To him, it's just a loss of an avatar. It will just waste a bit of his strength but not deal him any actual harm. And he can use the death of his avatar to see the corresponding changes in fate. From that, he will be able to see the source of the stir or the creation of the waves. Although this doesn't allow him to directly lock onto you and me, he will be able to greatly reduce the circle, creating the conditions for his actual body to deal a lethal blow. Besides, do you think there will only be one avatar of Aemon in Backland? Based on his habits and style, he might only have one avatar that he doesn't hide, but in fact, surrounding this beacon are several dozens, or even more than 100 avatars. When we attempt to eliminate the one that's out in the open, it might very well be the case that a few dozens, or more than 100 Aemons will appear from every spot. He could be a passerby, a bird on the roof, an ant on the ground, and he could also be an insect in wooden logs, microbes in the air. One who isn't a demigod wouldn't notice it even if his avatar invades their bodies. As he listened to Old Man's detailed description, Leonard felt a chill run through his back. He suddenly had a feeling that the surrounding air was filled with countless Aemons. You're afraid now. Pallas Zoroast chuckled. If you understand how Aemon can steal away your fate without showing any anomalies, you will be even more terrified. What do you mean by stealing away my fate? Leonard asked, feeling wary and puzzled. Pales's old voice sighed. He will follow you back. Then, you'll discover that your parents will be making him their son. Your wife will view him as her husband. Your child will treat him as their father. Your friends, everyone you know, will treat him as you. And you will be the unlucky one. You will lose all connection with the real world and slowly die. Would such a theft be permanent? Leonard couldn't help but draw a gasp. Pallas Zoroast sniggered. Before a thief is caught, will he volunteer to return what he stole? Unless he has had enough fun with it. Leonard instantly fell silent. He felt that an enemy at Aemon's level was no longer someone one could defend themselves against but was completely unfathomable. After a few seconds, he asked, hardly being able to hide his hoarse voice, then what do we do? He didn't share his own thoughts because they were most likely unpragmatic. Pallas Zoroast fell silent for a moment before saying, let's watch and see. Ellipsis. Inside the Bravehearts bar. Marich was waiting at billiard room 3 according to the agreement. Since Sherlock Moriarty had agreed to provide help, discussing the operation's details face-to-face was necessary. It wasn't something that could be figured out via an exchange of letters. Guzzling down a mouthful of beer, Marich raised his hand to comb his hair. His pale face was drained of the color of blood. The demented look on his face was a lot less than before. At this moment, his heart stirred. He looked up to the side and saw a figure in a top hat and formal suit outline quickly. It was none other than Sherlock Moriarty. Teleport. Marich's heart palpitated as his pupils constricted. He instinctively raised his level of wariness. This wasn't because he didn't trust Sherlock Moriarty, but a natural reaction for a creature when facing a higher existence on the food chain. At the same time, he noticed through the corner of his eye that Sharon's doll-like figure had appeared on the high stool. Klein pressed down his hat and bowed at the two. He said with a smile, what I'm most concerned about is the amount of intel you have. If there's sufficient intel, the chances of success will be higher and the risks lower. Let me raise a simple example. Do you believe that Tutanses II's mummy doesn't have any problems? Can you confirm which coffin it is in? If you can, I can teleport over before the guards react, traveling with it through the spirit world. That way, the problem will be resolved. Just as Marich tried recalling, he heard Sharon say in a calm tone, it can be confirmed which coffin it is, but we cannot confirm if there are any problems with it. Klein nodded and pulled a chair over to sit. Apart from that, what else do you know? Sharon's blue eyes moved slightly. It might be a trap by the Rose School of Thought, or it might be a trap by the Lowen military. You didn't mention the second guess previously. That's right, before obtaining any confirmation of cooperating together, even I wouldn't divulge too much, Klein thought as he questioned, targeting the latter point. A trap meant for the Rose School of Thought. Marich answered this time. He said in detail, in the ancient Highlands kingdom, creating a mummy was the tradition for an esteemed person. It's considered sacred, and the pharaoh's mummy is not something to be blasphemed against. Back then, before the Loan, Intis, and Phenopota allied forces attacked this kingdom, the pharaoh's descendants had moved the most important batch of mummies, including the remains of the pharaohs of past dynasties. This time, one of the highlands' rebel armies had their secret base stormed. The Loan army found the Tutanses II mummy at the lowest level and plan on delivering it to Baklan to hand it to an unknown military organization for research. To the pharaoh's descendants, this is an insult of the greatest order. They have a sufficient motive to snatch Tutanses II's mummy back. And among these descendants, there's a demigod named Marmossi. He's both one of the main leaders of the rebel army and is also an important member of the Rose School of Thought. He's the student of Abomination Sewer. Klein nodded slightly and answered, that is to say that Tutanses II's mummy might be bait for the Loan army to fish out Marmossi. Of course, this doesn't exclude the possibility that the Rose School of Thought is deliberately sacrificing a pharaoh's remains to eliminate you. He originally wanted to say that as a sequence 6 and 5, there was no need for the Rose School of Thought to go to such an extent. But when he recalled that the present main faction of the Rose School of Thought was indulgence, with them not holding back when it came to their desire for revenge, he believed that he couldn't make a decision using an ordinary person's point of view. Furthermore, Miss Sharon and Marriage were able to escape the Mother Tree of Desire's restrictions and successfully escape from the Rose School of Thought. Apart from luck, they might have someone supporting them in secret. If there is such a person, that person is definitely a target the Rose School of Thought wants to be uprooted. Klein's mind naturally formulated these thoughts, but he didn't say it out loud. Yes, Marriage said as he rubbed the corners of his eyes. The large amount of words he said had made him feel perturbed both in mind and desire. Klein thought for a moment before saying, if it's the former, the situation might be more troublesome than I imagined. To deal with a demigod with companions, the Loan army will have at least 2 Beyonders at the same combat level as Marmossi lying in ambush. Apart from that, they will definitely have some redundancies to prevent any accidents. For example, they will prepare a Grade 0 sealed artifact. In short, if this isn't near Bakland or made into a joint operation with the 3 churches, it might not be possible to so easily set up such a trap. Sharon's chin moved slightly as she nodded in agreement with Sherlock Moriarty's judgment. Klein didn't emphasize the difficulty as he said, therefore, we have to obtain more accurate and detailed intel. From that, we can make more targeted preparations. This will allow us to achieve our goals. Without waiting for Sharon and Marriage to say a word, he added, I know of a secret existence for magic mirror divination. He strictly adheres to a principle of reciprocity. If you do not mind your privacy or actions that will bring about intense humiliation, you can obtain answers to many questions from him. Are you willing to try? I'll perform the summoning. In dark divination, whoever did the summoning typically suffered the greatest risk. What happens if I refuse to divulge my private matters or reject doing such actions? Marriage asked with narrowed eyes. Klein sincerely replied, you'll suffer a lightning strike, causing quite significant damage. Lightning strike. Marriage originally believed that with a zombie's toughness, it wasn't too big a problem to suffer any direct damage, but he had never expected it to be lightning, which was relatively strong against the dead. He hesitated for a moment and glanced at Sharon. After receiving an affirmative nod, he exhaled and said, okay. Klein didn't speak further. He took out a piece of paper from his pocket as he instructed, prepare a mirror. Just as he said that, a palm-sized makeup mirror appeared on the billiard table. A regal-styled makeup mirror. Klein glanced at it and drew a symbol that was a mixture of concealment and mystery prying. With Klein finishing his final stroke, the lights in billiard room 3 dimmed. On the dainty makeup mirror, aqueous patterns rippled out before turning into a dark scene. Immediately, one bloody word after another appeared, raise your questions. This scene was filled with a sense of supernatural horror. Even though standing there was a wraith and a zombie, they couldn't help but feel overwhelmed as they momentarily didn't dare say a word. Only Klein continued wearing a smile as though he was accustomed to all of this. He had previously exhorted Rhodes to not raise questions that were too difficult or private, and also to not act like a servant. If it wasn't because Sharon and Marriage could ask much more targeted questions as a result of understanding the situation better, Klein was more inclined to handling it himself and not exposing the reality of having such a helper. After a few seconds of silence, Marriage took 2 steps forward, came to the billiard table, and opened his mouth. At this moment, Sharon's gentle but emotionless voice sounded, I'll ask the questions. Without waiting for Marriage to answer, she floated up into a standing position and looked at the mirror. Is the Tutankhamun mummy a trap that the Loan military set up to target the Rose School of Thought? The mirror's blood-red words melted away and slid down, dragging away the stains, barely leaving two words behind which wriggled to form, "That's right." It is indeed a trap the Loan military set up for the Rose School of Thought. We can preliminarily eliminate the situation that it's a plot the Rose School of Thought has to target Miss Sharon and marriage. After all, the risk involved exceeds the value of a sequence 5 and 6 combined. Even if the Rose School of Thought can't curb the desire for revenge, they wouldn't be this crazy, unless they were already planning on dealing with the Loan military and decided to involve this matter as well. If that's the case, the best place to have such a matter unfold would be in the southern continent or at sea, and not somewhere in the vicinity of Backland. Who knows what kind of terrifying fellows are hidden here? Amidst his thoughts, Klein saw the surface of the mirror turn dark again as new blood-colored words appeared. Based on the principle of reciprocity, it's my turn to ask a question. If you answer wrong or lie, you will be punished. Rather obedient. He didn't make the request of doing artistic actions. Looking at the billiard table, Klein nodded indiscernibly. At this moment, the words from before slowly vanished, presenting new words. You. As the bloody word froze for a full 3 seconds, it followed up, to answer with the relationship between the chained god and the mother tree of desire. For some reason, Klein felt that the remaining parts of the sentence had its blood-colored text darkened significantly. Thankfully, the question wasn't too out of place, and it was something he would like to know. Sharon looked at the mirror and replied in a deadpan manner. Since the Fifth Epoch, after the perishing of death, the Eggers family gradually lost control over the Star Highlands and Paz Valley, allowing those places to have their own Beyonder organization, the Rose School of Thought. In the beginning, there wasn't the Mother Tree of Desire, only the Chained God. The Rose School of Thought advocated temperance and established a religious ritual system, including laws. Formal members led ascetic lives to deal with the repercussions of receiving powers. One day, a divine revelation added terms about indulgence. Many people slowly changed and restored ancient but bloody primitive sacrificial traditions. Later, the School of Thought's upper echelons began secretly calling the Chained God the manifestation of the Mother Tree of Desire. By the sound of it, the Chained God was corrupted by the Mother Tree of Desire bit by bit or replaced. If this entity was once a sequence 0, then the Mother Tree of Desire is truly terrifying. It's no wonder it's viewed as an enemy by all the other deities. However, the Chained God might not be a sequence 0. There's a small possibility of being a uniqueness that has fully come to life, or a king of angels with 2 sequence 1 characteristics, or even someone weaker. There's currently not enough information to verify the matter. Klein frowned slightly as he began thinking about the matters regarding the Mother Tree of Desire. At this moment, Sharon had switched to asking, what problems does the Tutankhamun mummy possess? On the mirror's surface, the blood-red text squirmed and changed into a complete sentence. It's filled with hexes, a manifestation of hexes. It has the possibility of automatically becoming a zombie. This mummy is comprised of hexes. As expected of a corpse left behind by a high-sequence Beyonder. How should this be resolved? Klein turned to look at Sharon and Marich and discovered that they were sufficiently calm without any hint of surprise, as though they already knew that. And this also meant that they had the means to resolve the matter. Of course, Sharon didn't have much of an expression regardless of the matter. She was as calm as she always was. After Rhodes answered, it followed the principle of reciprocity and raised its question. You have been trying hard to increase your sequence. Why do you do so? This time, it had used the same bloody text as the opening, but the words that followed after a few seconds didn't appear that bright. Does this mean that Rhodes is hesitating and struggling, resisting its own urges? On the one hand, it finds it difficult to curb its wishes to raise difficult-to-answer questions, but on the other hand, it's taking my instructions into considerations and thus holding back. Klein thought in amusement. Sharon stood there in silence before gently moving her lips. In the beginning, it was to not be bullied by others. Now, it's to have the strength to protect myself and my companions, and revenge, as well as spread the principle of temperance. If everyone can temper their desires, to not have wars and killing, there will be less misery. Klein was surprised by what he heard. His impression of Sharon was that she was a woman of few words. It wasn't that she couldn't say that many words, but that even if she had much to say, she held back greatly and didn't provide any additional descriptions. For example, in her answer to the first question, she had simply recounted the situation, and although she appeared to say a lot, she hadn't said one word more or anything subjective. The words she added towards the end was a relatively talkative act based on her character. This is something that's been on her mind, a point of view that she has been repressing for a very long time. Klein suddenly imagined the chaotic reality of the wars in the southern continent. They were lands with plenty of slavery. There were batches of people from the lower class who died of hunger and sickness. There were constant wars and life sacrifices. If I were born in the southern continent and could live to this point, I'll definitely wish for world peace and happiness to the people. Speaking of which, Miss Sharon and Marriage do not look like they are of southern continent descent. That's right, before death perished, passage between the northern and southern continent was allowed. Also, Sharon mentioned revenge. That word was said without conviction, as though she doesn't hold out hope for it. Or does she not have that strong of a desire for it? Klein sighed silently as he watched Sharon raise detail after detail and answer question after question. After learning of the situation regarding the Tutankhamun II mummy, Sharon asked again, apart from Marmossi, who are the high-sequence beyonders that will appear in this trap? The mirror surface's aqueous wave rippled and formed a bright light, one that enveloped everything. Nothing else could be seen. With Rhodes's powers, it likely involves an Angel or Grade Zero sealed artifact. That's why it wasn't able to provide an accurate answer. Klein retracted his gaze and said to Sharon and Marriage with a smile, from the looks of it, it's as I guessed. The Loan military has prepared plenty of redundancies. Sharon nodded slightly as she continued staring at the mirror, awaiting the secret existence to raise his question. The blood-colored text squirmed and no longer paused like before. Everything appeared at once. What are your thoughts regarding your teacher? Teacher? Miss Sharon has a teacher. That's right, as part of the Temperance faction, to not be influenced by the Rose school of thought which had changed internally, and to keep to her original path, someone must have provided her with help. This is also one of the reasons why she and Marriage could escape. Enlightened, Klein anticipated Sharon's answer. Sharon pursed her lips. I respect her. She used her. Klein nearly couldn't maintain his smile from the shock. Including the Orthodox churches and the various major Beyonder organizations, grounded angels were very rare. There might only be one or two. He originally imagined that Sharon's teacher was a sequence 4 or 3 synth with a peak strength equivalent to C. King Yarn Kotman. To his surprise, she had used her as a pronoun. In Loan, Ancient Phazak, and even Jotun and Elvish, this pronoun was very different from his, her, its. After his shock, Klein suddenly sighed deeply. Miss Sharon's current situation largely implies that her teacher is probably not around. She and Marriage escaped perhaps due to the final struggle of the Temperance faction within the Rose school of thought. And to the Mother Tree of Desire, either its corruption or decimation to create a sealed artifact. There will not be any other choices. The mirror turned dark again as the bright red text vanished. After a while, new words appeared again. Continue. I no longer have any questions. Thank you for your help, Sharon curtsied as she said slowly. With her saying that, the mirror returned to normal. The lighting in the billiard room wasn't dim any longer. Sharon looked at Klein and said in a tone without any abnormalities, we shall forego this matter. Clearly, she also understood the meaning behind the blast of light that appeared during the hidden existence's final answer. Klein shook his head and smiled. There's no need to rush into a decision. Let me ask you a few more things. Perhaps there might still be a chance that doesn't require us to take too much of a risk. At least my divination results say that it's possible. He added silently. What is it? Marriage couldn't help but ask. Upon hearing Marriage's question, Klein picked up the piece of paper with the symbol that summoned a Rhodes and shook it as he wiped away his smile. He said in all seriousness, tell me the detailed process for creating a pharaoh mummy in the ancient Highlands kingdom. As he said that, the piece of paper was engulfed in scarlet-red flames, turning to ash. Marriage glanced at Sharon and replied after some thought. First step, lay it down for 3 to 5 days and use some auxiliary methods to make the Beyonder characteristic naturally seep out and not become a sealed artifact from fusing with any parts of the pharaoh's body. Second step, hold a cleansing ritual. Place the corpse on an altar, pray to the chained god, and hope that half the deceased spirit remains in the body. This won't affect the return of the Son of God, and it can also allow the created mummy to maintain a long period of spirituality. Third step, using Beyonder powers or actual technology, remove the corpse's brain, innards, and bodily fluids, leaving only the heart. Fourth step, stuff the corpse with perfumes and medicine that's filled with spirituality and completely dehydrate the body. Fifth step, stuff the perfumes and medicine inside again. Arrange some preparations for a ritual on the corpse's surface, then wrap it up in linen bandages before putting it into a sarcophagus. 6th step, the organs which were handled in a similar manner as the 4th step will be used as materials for the ritual. They will be placed in the 4 corners of the sarcophagus. Likewise for the brain and bodily fluids. The former will be stirred into mush, mixing with the latter. And the sarcophagus will have some preserved circulatory tracts that mimic the deceased state before death. This can gather spirituality from the spirit world and the surroundings, making the pharaoh mummy an ingredient rich in spirituality even after more than a millennium. It can be made into a rather powerful zombie. Sounds like it has nothing to do with enhancing one's ability in that area. I wonder how apothecaries turn such rot into a miracle. Yes, there seems to be a difference in the way Egyptian mummies are made on Earth. The level of mysticism involved is a lot greater. Klein finished listening carefully and quickly analyzed if there was anything that could be used as part of the plan. Regardless, Tutankhamun II's mummy is something with extreme research value. Unless it's necessary, no one is willing to destroy it. Klein fell into deep thought for a moment before looking at Sharon, who had returned onto her high stool. He asked with a solemn expression, "What's the furthest distance you can travel with Mirror Blink?" Sharon sat there and answered without any hesitation, 300 meters. That's far enough, much better than my flaming jump. However, this is expected. After all, a wraith's main trait is to come and go without detection, while flaming jump is just part of a magic show. Not bad. This can be used. Klein couldn't help but inwardly make a poignant remark. Although he once had a wraith marionette, he didn't know the limits of Mirror Blink, because before it could reach its limit, it would slip out from his control radius. Once that happened, the marionette was equivalent to a dead object. The blink would fail midway. Klein asked a few more questions and formulated a general plan. After looking at Sharon and Marich separately, he said with a steady tone, "We still have a chance of snatching Tutankhamun II's mummy away. There is a risk, but it won't be high. Yes, that's on the condition that the two of you listen to my instructions. Let me lead this operation. Of course, if you believe it's unacceptable, you can choose to terminate the operation midway and choose to return. That's your freedom. Just remember to pay me." If this was in the past, Marich would have rejected the proposal without a thought. He and Sherlock were considered very experienced mid-sequence beyonders, so how could he listen to a newly advanced beyonder who had once sought their protection before? But after the previous cooperation effort, the intelligence, adaptability, and the mysterious items Sherlock Moriarty possessed had left a deep impression on Marich. He couldn't help but consider him as equals. When news of Gehrman Sparrow continuously reached Backland, he had been shocked, being even more convinced that he was one of the strongest beyonders below that of high-sequence beyonders. In mysticism, this was a form of authority when it came to beyonder combat. Since he possessed authority, it meant abiding by it. He can still teleport. Marich recalled the way Sherlock Moriarty appeared, and he had a strong sense of confidence bolstered within him. Perhaps there was a chance of success. He turned his head and looked at Sharon. The two nodded in unison. "All right," Sharon responded, her blue eyes not showing any signs of hesitation. Klein immediately revealed a smile. "I'll go into the specifics when we rendezvous at the scene." Apart from defining the problems and obtaining a more accurate account of the situation, his deliberate appearance using traveling and providing a secret existence to obtain intel was also to establish his image. It boosted the way they viewed him, giving him the ability to be in charge. As a marionettist, even without a marionette for the time being, he had to control others to complete a targeted act. To Klein, this operation was partly to help Sharon and Marich, but he also had hopes of using this grand act and his directing of puppets to further accelerate the digestion of his potion. It had to be said that the immense pressure of Eamon's appearance in Backland and his recent interaction with spectators had allowed the marionette less him to greater understand the marionettist principle he had previously concluded. With his marionette as a lead, he could control his enemies to put on a puppet act in real life. His current idea was, even without a marionette, he could use his dominance, language, and the settings he designed, or a combination of these factors, to control his target, putting on a puppet act in real life. Marionettists weren't only controlling spirit-body threads. And what he did previously was merely a small attempt. Just like Eamon, a simple appearance is enough to put many matters into motion. It makes me and Pallas Zoroast appear to be waiting for him to signal with a wave of the conductor's baton. Klein silently sighed as he heard Sharon and Marich answer in unison, "Okay." Ellipsis. In the evening at Pritz Harbor, there were elegant gas street lamps made of black metal. They illuminated the various streets with the light they emitted. At this moment, most of the ships had moored. Silence was the main tune of the area. At the top of a warehouse, there were many wooden crates circling an area. 3 figures suddenly appeared from the void. They were none other than Sherlock Moriarty in his formal suit and top hat, Marich in his white shirt and black vest, and Sharon, who always wore a black bonnet and regal dress. With the help of teleport, they directly traveled from Backland all the way here. There was quite a distance between them and the dock where the ship that carried the Tutankhamun II mummy was moored at. Klein pressed down with his right hand as the bottom of his feet stepped on the wood. He nimbly leaped above the crossbar and, like walking on flat ground, quickly arrived by the wall. There was a tiny air vent here. He then took out the telescope provided by Sharon, and he looked at the dock based on the intel. All the building roofs were occupied by soldiers with steam backpacks and thick-barreled rifles. They patrolled the area and were alert of their surroundings, prepared to shoot at any trespassers who dared come near. Only one warning was to be given. Apart from them, there were a few exaggerated robot monsters parked around the dock. They were entirely metal, and their height had exceeded that of giants. At the top of them, cold machine guns could rotate, and a steam chimney stood erect. The bottoms were grayish-white in color, with many parts exposing rivets, nuts, and gears. They looked rather crude. In addition, in front of the robots was a very thick cannon. Situated underneath it were 2 rows of metal wheels with rubber treads. They were obviously manned, but Klein couldn't see who they were, making it impossible to determine if they were beyonders or not. Close to these steel monsters, above the dock was a dark black metal tower standing at a height of more than 10 meters. It had a complicated pulley system that seemed to lack any sophistication. Drooping down were steel cables and a hook. On the surface, it doesn't seem too simple, but it can't be considered a high-level military operation. Klein retracted his gaze and threw the telescope to the approaching Marich so that he could observe the situation. Before they started taking action, they had come to an agreement. It was to not use beyonder powers, relying on non-mysticism methods to spy on their target to avoid sounding off any alarms. After all, it was very likely that a demigod was lurking in the dock district. Of course, Klein had adjusted the powers recorded inside Creeping Hunger. He had matched Paper Angel with Hurricane instead of Lightning Storm. After Sharon was kept up to date with the situation, Klein, who was standing by a wooden frame, revealed a seemingly relaxed smile. "We only have one purpose today. It is to make an attempt if there's a chance. If there isn't, we'd rather observe by the side and even evacuate ahead of time." "Any questions?" "No," Sharon calmly replied. Marich shook his head, expressing the same intent. Klein nodded and looked at Marich. "How many mirrors have you brought?" 9. Marich showed his preparations as he pointed to his eyes. "These also count." "All right." Klein pointed in a direction. "When I leave, you are to head for Pritz Harbor. Along the way, throw these mirrors." Marich gaped as though he wanted to ask why. But soon, he understood Sherlock Moriarty's intentions and nodded seriously. "I'll follow your instructions." Klein smiled as he extended his hand in midair. "I hope for a pleasant partnership." Marich hesitated for a second before extending his right hand to struck palms with him. After doing this, the tense feelings in him felt relieved for some reason. Klein turned to Sharon, took out an iron cigar case, and passed it to her. "Take this. After receiving my cue, fly towards the lighthouse. Following that, silently count down from 3 before removing the wall of spirituality. During this process, as well as after it's completed, you must not stop flying. Try to fly as irregularly as possible, regardless of the methods employed. When you see me create fireworks, immediately isolate the cigar case with a wall of spirituality, and do a mirror blink in Marich's direction. Use everything you have. After you meet up, flee all the way without waiting for me. I'll teleport to you." One of the core items in the operation tonight was Azek's copper whistle. Stealing the Tutankhamun II mummy is difficult, but I can get it to run towards me. After hearing Sherlock Moriarty's plan, Sharon didn't say anything apart from nod her head once in agreement. Klein immediately took out a steel gray metal mask and wore it, only revealing his eyes and nostrils. Similarly, Sharon and Marich wore similar masks as well. However, they had different reasons for the disguise. For the Wraith and Zombie, it was solely to prevent themselves from being recognized by the Loan military, thus, curtailing their ability to be active in Backland. As for a faceless, the act of wearing a mask hid his pathway's trait of being able to change appearances. It was a form of misdirection for the Lowen militaries and Rose school of thought's subsequent investigations. After all, they would follow normal logic. Since your face was fake to begin with, why would you do the unnecessary act of wearing a mask? After waiting for a while, a dull whistle sounded as a ship cruised into the port in the darkness. Klein returned to the vent, raised the telescope, and cast his gaze at the heavily guarded harbor. He soon saw a hybrid sailboat with a chimney slowing down as it docked. Meanwhile, 2 squads of soldiers in red tops and white pants ran over in an orderly fashion with rifles in hand before standing on 2 sides of a path. Before long, a gangway was lowered, and people from the ship began alighting. First were sailors carrying wooden crates. Following that, it was a young man dressed in a major's uniform. He held a small casket made of crystal with a heavy expression. Surrounding him were several members of the ship's crew. The crew were holding lanterns, illuminating the casket from various angles, thus, accentuating what was inside. In it was a human skull without any flesh and blood left. It had a strange luster swirling under the light. The group of people moved at a rather slow speed, as though they were constantly taking note of the angles of illumination to not leave any dark spots. After they got off the ship, they followed the path to the nearest cargo rail where a steam locomotive was waiting there like a giant serpent. In the cabin behind, a man in a black formal suit walked out. He was carrying a huge iron bucket, and diagonally above, one could see that it contained layers of ice blocks. For a second, Klein nearly imagined that there was a bottle of wine inside the ice blocks, just like how alcohol was presented amongst high society and high-end restaurants. However, he soon saw what was embedded in the ice. It was a hand made purely out of gold. Unlike the group of people, the man carrying the bucket moved very quickly. Beads of perspiration kept dripping from his forehead as the contact between his palms and the metal surface produced mist. He seemed to be worried that the ice would completely melt before he arrived at his destination. The military managed to plunder quite a number of sealed artifacts at the Star Highlands, Paz Valley, and Hagati Plains. Klein sighed poignantly as he patiently waited for Tutanses II's sarcophagus to appear. Another 10+ minutes passed when, situated in the distance, Klein, Sharon, and Marich heard heavy footsteps. It was like a giant walking over a hollow deck. Right on the heels of that, the cabin's side door opened. 4 knights, in black full-body armor carried a golden sarcophagus as they slowly walked out. Their footsteps clinked and clanked, reverberating. The sarcophagus's surface was engraved with symbols like strange birds, serpents, feathers, and masks. It appeared ancient and mysterious, with the rich flair of an ancient Highlands kingdom. It was none other than the Tutanses II mummy's resting bed. Sounds of metallic chains grinding against each other sounded as a pitch-black metal capstan slowly rotated, lowering the steel cables and hook down. People began securing him against the corners of Tutanses II's sarcophagus. Then, a complicated gear system began operating as the heavy sarcophagus was hung up, moving towards a topless carriage outside the harbor. The 4 black, full-bodied armored knights had the pressure on them relieved as they sat on the deck, letting out heavy panting. Amidst the panting, one of the knights suddenly grunted. In a crevice of his armor, dark red blood streamed out in increasing amounts. Towards the end, tiny black armored worms began crawling out of it. Thud! The knight fell backward, his helmet falling off, revealing mangled flesh and a head whose eye sockets were empty. Countless black armored worms crawled out. A hex. Tutanses II's mummy is a manifestation of hexes itself. Even when wearing armor with augmented blessings, it's unable to completely avoid being cursed. Klein sighed silently as he cast his gaze to the golden sarcophagus which was being slowly lowered onto the carriage. The carriage outside the harbor didn't have any horses. Standing around the carriage were 4 knights, in the same outfits as the ones before. With the sarcophagus landing, they approached the carriage in preparation to pull it. At this moment, the wheels of the carriage suddenly began spinning as it maintained its balance and began moving towards the side. At that moment, it seemed to come to life. Klein's mind tensed up as his gaze turned intense. Pa, pa, pa. The wheels spun rapidly, slamming into the rocks, logs, and steps on an irregular path. The carriage without any horses dragged the golden sarcophagus as it moved towards an empty spot of the harbor. This scene looked like a scene as described in a horror story. Close to the harbor, a steel monster with a chimney, cannon, and machine gun turned around as a deep voice was heard from the inside without any obstacles. Possession is prohibited here. Just as this was said, the carriage which was moving by itself lost its drive. After drawing out 2 long tracks, it steadily came to a halt. At the same time, a figure wearing a white robe with golden threads was outlined in midair. He had pale yellow curled hair, with his eye sockets clearly recessed. His face was thin to the bone. This was a middle-aged man with mixed heritage from the southern and northern continent. His brown eyes had irrepressible maleficence and madness. His rather thick lips were pierced with dense, patterned golden nails that sealed his mouth. He exuded a sinister and terrifying feeling. According to Sharon's and Marrich's description of the characteristics and portrait, Klein instantly recognized him to be an important member of the Rose School of Thought, one of the leaders of the Highlands rebel army, Marmossi, who had the nickname, the Silent One. Just as Marmossi appeared, he cast his gaze to the steel monster that had issued the command. He completely ignored the Tutanses II sarcophagus that was staying put diagonally beneath him. His previous attempt was apparently to determine the location of the Loan military's demigod. In a snap, Marmossi raised his right hand and pulled at the corner of his mouth. The golden nails that pierced through his lips shot out like bullets as they no longer sealed his mouth. Following that, Marmossi opened his mouth. Klein didn't hear any sound, nor did he see any light. He discovered the gigantic steam chariot seemed to warp like it was melting. In a blink of an eye, it had transformed into a goat. A goat with glazed eyes and messy wool. With a spurting sound, blood spewed out of the goat's abdomen as a blob of flesh rolled out. Embedded in it was a white glove and a golden mask. A beam suddenly shot out from the flesh, cleaving through all the chaos and evilness. The squirming flesh and blood began forming a humanoid figure, returning to its original appearance. It was a black-haired, golden-eyed man with a mask. At this moment, Marmossi raised his palm, causing all the guns and cannons that were aiming at him to rise into the sky as they shot into the air. Then, he took out a cloth doll. The doll seemed to be made of old cloth. There were obvious stains and specks of blood. Its eyes had been dug out, leaving 2 empty holes. The moment it saw light, its face began transforming. Its target of reference was none other than the demigod from the Loan military. Its eye sockets were aimed straight at the man in the golden mask. When the Loan military's demigod saw this, he immediately made the ring on his right hand emit a crystalline beam of light as he vanished from his spot, phasing to the back of Marmossi. However, the doll's transformation didn't stop at all. Meanwhile, to the side of Tutanses II's sarcophagus, the space around it warped as a translucent mouth spanning more than 10 meters was outlined. The mouth suddenly opened and sucked in, creating a terrifying gale that swept up the sarcophagus and the carriage together. It was suspected to be a spirit world creature. It was about to devour the Tutanses II mummy's sarcophagus. Suddenly, the bullets and cannonballs that shot into the air turned brilliant as they gathered together, transforming into a grand sea of light that inundated everything. Klein felt a stabbing pain in his eyes, and even though he closed them in time, tears still flowed down. 2 seconds later, he opened his eyes again and saw the spirit world creature that was only a gigantic mouth had disappeared. Tutanses II's golden sarcophagus remained sitting silently on the other carriage. Marmossi's figure had blinked away to the other end of the harbor thanks to a metallic surface. The dirty doll in his hand had been restored to its original form while the masked golden-eyed man did a short-distance teleport as he engaged in tight pursuit. And the spot where the two were originally standing, a female figure in a black evening gown appeared. She too was wearing a golden mask, and on her head was a crown folded from thorns. On the crown, pure light quickly swirled, amassing an ocean, however, it was in a dim state. At this moment, Klein saw a hand wearing a black glove. It was hidden in the shadows, reaching out as it grabbed at the sarcophagus where Tutanses II's mummy was stored. The sarcophagus suddenly vanished, appearing right in front of the palm. The Rose School of Thought hadn't sent one demigod, but 2. Furthermore, they brought with them a sealed artifact from the Marauder pathway. Upon seeing this, Klein immediately turned his head and shouted to Marich, "Run!" Marich had been awaiting his orders, so he leaped up the moment he heard that, rushing out of the warehouse as he dashed fervently out of the harbor. Klein immediately turned around and yelled out to Sharon, "Begin!" Sharon didn't hesitate as well. Holding the iron cigar case, she flew towards the lighthouse. As a wraith, the walls and obstacles along the way were non-existent. The commotion she and Marich created had probably been detected, but as it was far from the harbor and far from the battlefield, no one paid attention or bothered. Klein quickly retracted his gaze, extended his left hand, and aimed his palm at the ventilation hole, right where Tutanses II's golden sarcophagus was. In less than a second, a blurry book materialized before him as an ethereal, distant chant sounded in his ears. I came, I saw, I record. The pages flipped before landing on one page. Hurricane. This was a demigod level beyond a power that had a wide area of effect.